Welcome, quiet traveler. Tonight we drift backward, far backward, into a world where winter was not simply an inconvenience, but a vast, patient adversary. A world where the air itself could kill you, where darkness stretched across months, and where every structure raised against the cold was an act of defiance and hope. You are about to step into the life of someone who lived 25,000 years ago in the frozen reaches of Siberia during the last glacial maximum. This was a time when glaciers crept across continents, when mammoths trudged through snow-thick valleys, and when small bands of humans clung to existence in shelters made from bone, hide, and ingenuity. Let the tension of your day begin to ease. Let your breathing slow. There is nothing here that requires your vigilance, only stories, textures, the quiet unfolding of lives lived so long ago that their struggles have become whispers in stone and bone. Before we slip into this frozen world together, I'd like to ask something small of you. If you're ready to wander back through time tonight, a gentle tap on the like button helps others find their way here too. The height feature just below, if it calls to you, sends this story a little farther into the night, toward those who might need its comfort. Subscribe, so these late hours can always hold a place for you, and leave a comment if you'd like. Tell me where you are right now, what hour it is in your corner of the world. Some of you are awake in deep night, others greeting dawn, others somewhere between. We're scattered across time zones, but here we meet in this one shared moment of stillness. Now, dim the lights if you wish. Perhaps switch on a fan for that soft, constant hum. Settle yourself, and let us begin our quiet passage into the coldest chapter of human endurance. You awake before dawn, though dawn is a fragile thing this deep into winter. The pale ghost of light has not yet touched the horizon, and it will not linger long when it does. Around you, beneath layers of reindeer hide and mammoth fur, the warmth of sleep is already fading, replaced by the creeping cold that has been waiting all night to reclaim you. The animal skin flap that serves as your shelter's door shivers and snaps in the wind. Beyond it, the world is white, silent, and merciless. Inside, the air tastes of smoke, thick, acrid, clinging to the back of your throat. Your bones ache, not the sharp ache of injury, but the deep, dull ache of cold that has soaked into your marrow and refuses to leave. Your fingers are stiff, your joints resist movement. You lie there a moment longer, gathering yourself for what must come next. Every morning begins this way. Every morning you must choose to rise. You slip your hands through the frozen straps of the shelter's inner ties, fingers clumsy, leather crackling with frost. The hides that wall you in, sewn with sinew, layered 3 or 4 deep, are rigid along their edges where condensation has frozen overnight. Touch them, and your skin sticks briefly, painfully. You've learned not to touch them directly. Standing is an effort. Your legs are stiff from sleeping curled tight, knees drawn to chest, body contracted to conserve every scrap of warmth. Around you, others are stirring or not stirring. Some mornings, the very old or the very young do not rise at all. You've learned not to call out to them too quickly. You've learned to wait and see who opens their eyes. The fire in the center of the shelter has died down to embers. A faint orange glow pulses in the ash, barely enough to see by, not nearly enough to warm by. You will need to coax it back to life. You will need to feed it carefully, gently, with the driest kindling you can find. But kindling, in winter, is a rare and precious thing. Outside, beyond the flap, the snow crunches underfoot as someone else, perhaps a cousin, perhaps your father, begins the first task of the day. You hear the soft scrape of a stone tool against ice, the muffled thud of snow being shaken from the outer hides that roof your dwelling. Last night's storm has left its mark. There will be drifts to clear. There will be repairs to make. You pull on your outermost layer. A reindeer hide, the fur turned inward, the outer surface stiff with old weather and smoke curing. It smells of animal fat, of sweat, of smoke. It smells of survival. Beneath this, you wear other layers, wolf-hide leggings, a tunic of mammoth skin, thick moccasin-like boots lined with dried grass and moss. Each piece was sewn with sinew thread, each seam sealed with rendered fat to keep water out. But no seam is perfect. Cold finds its way in. Moisture, too, your own sweat, the damp of melting snow, finds its way in and then freezes against your skin when you stop moving. You tie the straps of your hood beneath your chin, pull the fur close around your face. Only your eyes remain exposed. Even your breath will freeze into tiny crystals on the fur near your mouth as the day wears on. You step through the flap into the world. The cold strikes you immediately. It is not a gradual thing, it is a wall. The air sears your lungs and you instinctively breathe shallow, slow through your nose, letting the narrow passages warm the air before it reaches deeper. The wind is relentless here, sweeping down from the north, unbroken by trees. There are few trees this far into the steppe tundra. What trees exist are stunted, gnarled, half buried in snow. Most of your firewood comes from driftwood along the frozen riverbanks or from the bones of animals. Yes, bones burn. Mammoth bones, thick and marrow-rich, burn slow and hot when the wood runs out. The sky above is a pale, colourless grey. No sun yet. Perhaps no sun today at all. Some days the clouds hang so low and thick that the sun never truly appears, only a vague brightening in the south, a suggestion of light that comes and goes within a few short hours. Your shelter sits on the bank of a frozen river. Ice extends in every direction, smooth in some places, buckled and jagged in others, where the current beneath has fought against the freeze. In summer, this river is a lifeline, water, fish, travel. In winter, it is a highway of ice, a place to cross carefully, a place where the wind howls unobstructed. Around you, other shelters crouch low against the earth. Your band is small, perhaps 20 souls, perhaps 30, depending on how many survived the autumn. Each family unit has its own dwelling, though dwelling is perhaps too grand a word. These are structures of necessity, frameworks of mammoth rib bones or long branches, covered with layered hides, banked with snow and earth for insulation, low to the ground to minimize wind resistance. Some shelters are little more than lean-tos, others are more substantial, dome-shaped huts reinforced with interlocking tusks or large leg bones, their entrances oriented away from the prevailing wind. Yours is somewhere in between, functional, fragile, enough. You join the others in the first task, shaking snow from the roof hides. If too much accumulates, the weight will collapse the framework. You've seen it happen. You've helped dig people out. So you shake and sweep and adjust the supports and check the seams where the hides overlap. Ice has formed along the lower edges overnight. You chip it away with a stone scraper carefully so as not to tear the hide. A tear means cold air pouring in. A tear means hours of work to repair, work done with numb fingers and failing light. Nearby, someone has already begun working on the fire outside, a communal fire larger than the ones kept inside each shelter, used for cooking, for gathering, for melting snow into water. The wood is damp, it resists the flame. Smoke rises in thick, grey plumes, and you squint against it, eyes watering. But eventually the fire catches. Someone feeds it carefully with dried moss, with small twigs, with shavings of bone. Fire is life. Fire is the difference between sleep and death. Water is the next task. You take a stone bowl, carved painstakingly from a river stone, heavy and cold in your hands, and you gather snow. Not just any snow. The surface snow is dirty, wind-blown, mixed with ash and grit. You dig down, seeking the cleaner snow beneath, and you pack it into the bowl. Then you set it near the fire, and you wait. Melting snow takes time. Melting enough snow to drink, to cook with, takes longer. You will make many trips today. You will melt many bowls of snow. While the snow melts, you tend to your own shelter's hearth. Inside, you kneel by the embers, your breath forming clouds, and you feed the fire with the driest kindling you have saved. Scraps of lichen, dried moss, tiny twigs hoarded from weeks ago. You blow gently, steadily, coaxing the embers to remember their purpose. The smoke curls upward, seeking the small vent at the top of the shelter. Most of it escapes, not all. Your eyes sting, your throat burns. You've been breathing this smoke your entire life. Everyone has. It is the price of warmth. The fire grows, not large, never large inside a shelter. The risk of setting the hides ablaze is too great, but enough. Enough to push back the cold by a hand's width. Enough to warm your face, your hands. Enough to make the morning bearable. Now comes the endless work. There is always wood to find. You pull on your outer mittens, thick, furred gloves that make your hands clumsy, but keep your fingers from freezing black, and you set out with others from your band, following the river's edge. The snow is deep here, knee-deep in places, and walking is exhausting. Each step sinks. Each step must be pulled free. Your thighs burn. Your breath comes hard. You search for wood beneath the snow. Sometimes you find it, a branch, a limb, a precious log wedged against a rock. You dig with your hands with a flat bone shovel, clearing the snow away, dragging the wood free. It is frozen solid, heavy, encrusted with ice. You carry it back, bent beneath its weight, and stack it near the communal fire to dry. It will take days to dry, days you may not have. If no wood can be found, you gather bones instead. The land is scattered with them, mammoth bones, bison bones, the remains of hunts from seasons past, or from the deep past, from animals that died long before your band arrived. You learn to see them, half buried in snow, white against white. You learn which bones burn best, the large leg bones, the ribs, the tusks if they can be split. You drag them back to camp, one by one, an offering to the fire. But bones alone are not enough. Your band needs meat. Hunting in winter is an act of desperation wrapped in skill. The animals are scarce, wary, and fast. Reindeer move in herds, but they are elusive, their tracks covered by fresh snow within hours. Hares, foxes, ground birds, these can be snared, but snares must be checked, must be set with care, must be placed where the animals still travel. You wade through snow to set them, your hands numb, your eyes scanning for the faint trails that betray movement beneath the white. Some days you catch nothing. Some days you return to camp empty-handed, your stomach tight with hunger, your shoulders sagging. Other days, rare, precious days, you find a hare in your snare, its body still warm, its eyes clouded with death. You carry it back carefully, almost reverently. This small creature will feed several people. Its fur will be used. Its bones will be cracked for marrow. When larger game is spotted, a reindeer, a bison once, impossibly, a mammoth calf separated from its herd, the entire band mobilizes. The hunters take their spears, their atlatls, their carefully napped stone points. They move slowly, patiently through the snow. Hunting is not a sprint. It is a negotiation with the cold, with the wind, with the animal's instincts. One wrong sound, one gust carrying your scent, and the animal bolts. If the hunt succeeds, there is meat. Enough meat to last days, perhaps weeks if it is a large kill. The animal is butchered in the field, no sense dragging the whole carcass through deep snow. The hide is carefully removed, the meat stripped from bone, the organs taken, the fat rendered. Blood stains the snow, vivid red against white, steaming in the frozen air. Nothing is wasted. The stomach will be cleaned and used as a container. The sinew will be dried and used as thread. The bones will be tools or fuel or building material. But if the hunt fails, and it often does, the band's stores begin to dwindle. You have cached food from autumn, buried in pits beneath the permafrost, wrapped in hides and moss to protect it from scavengers. But these stores are finite. Each day you take a little. Each day you ration. Dried meat, dried fish, frozen berries if any were found before the snows came, roots dug from beneath the frozen earth with great effort. Some days you are hungry. Not starving, not yet, but hungry, in a way that gnaws at you, that makes your thoughts slow, your body weak. You learn to ignore it. You learn to drink water to fill your belly. You learn to wait. And through it all, the shelters must be maintained. Every day there are repairs. The wind tears at the hides. The cold makes the sinew bindings brittle. The snow accumulates. The framework shifts. You patch holes with scraps of hide, sewing them with frozen fingers and a bone needle. You reinforce the bone supports, wedging stones beneath them to keep them from sinking into the softening ground. Yes, even in winter, the ground beneath the hearth can thaw slightly, and the structure can shift, can tilt, can threaten to collapse. You adjust the roof hides, angling them to shed snow more effectively. You build windbreaks, low walls of stacked stone, or bone, or packed snow, to deflect the worst of the wind away from the entrances. You line the interior floors with moss, with dried grass, with layers of hide, anything to insulate against the cold rising from the earth. Inside the shelter, the microclimate is everything. Near the fire, it is warm, almost comfortable if you can ignore the smoke. A few feet away, the temperature plummets. The walls are damp with condensation that freezes into frost. You learn where to place your sleeping furs. You learn where to sit when your fingers are too cold to work. You learn to rotate, to shift positions, to share warmth with others. At night, when the fire burns low and the darkness presses in, you huddle together. Bodies pressed close, sharing heat, layered beneath every hide the band possesses. Children sleep between adults. The elderly are given the warmest positions. You lie there, listening to the wind howl, listening to the creak of bone supports, listening to the breathing of those around you. Sleep is fitful. The cold wakes you. The need to tend the fire wakes you. The sounds of the night, wolves howling in the distance, the crack of ice on the river, the groan of shifting snow, these wake you. You drift in and out, never fully resting, never fully warm. Sometimes someone coughs, a deep, wet cough that rattles in the chest. You know this sound, you have heard it before. Respiratory infections are common in winter. The smoke, the cold, the close quarters, they all conspire against the lungs. Some recover, some do not. You have seen both. Injuries, too, are constant. Frostbite on fingers and toes, the flesh turning white, then black. Cuts from stone tools that do not heal well in the cold. Twisted ankles from walking on ice. Broken bones from falls. The band has a healer, usually an elder, someone with knowledge passed down, someone who knows which plants to use, which rituals to perform. But there are limits to what can be done. Pain must often be endured. Loss must often be accepted. And then there is the emotional toll. The weight of winter is not only physical, it is the endless grey sky. It is the shortness of the days. It is the sameness of each morning, each task, each struggle. It is the fear that this winter will be the one that breaks you, that the food will run out, that the shelter will collapse, that the cold will finally win. You carry this weight quietly. Everyone does. There is no room for despair. Despair is a luxury, and luxury does not exist here. You wake, you work, you endure, you hope for spring. But spring is months away, and there are so many days between now and then. You learn to find small joys. A clear day when the sun appears, pale but present, and the world glitters with ice crystals. A successful hunt that brings meat and relief. A child's laughter, bright and unexpected, cutting through the cold. A story told around the fire, a song hummed in the dark, a memory of warmth. These moments are brief, but they are enough. They must be enough. As the days pass, the rhythm of survival becomes routine. Wake, tend fire, gather water, hunt or forage, repair shelter, eat if there is food, sleep, repeat. Day after day, week after week, moon after moon. The band works together. There is no choice. A single person cannot survive alone in this cold. You depend on each other for labor, for warmth, for hope. Tasks are divided by age, by skill, by strength. The young and strong hunt and gather. The old and experienced craft tools, prepare hides, mind the children. Everyone contributes. Everyone must. And when someone falls, illness, injury, age, the band grieves, but the band moves on. There is no time for prolonged mourning. The dead are honored, yes, wrapped in hides, placed in the frozen earth, or left in a sacred place for the spirits. But the living must continue. The cold does not pause for grief. You are part of this cycle. You are one thread in the fabric of the band's survival. Your hands build the shelters. Your feet track the game. Your voice joins the songs. And when your time comes, and it will come, whether in youth or age, you will become part of the landscape, another bone beneath the snow, another whisper in the wind. But for now, you endure. You stand outside your shelter as twilight falls. Earlier each day, it seems. The sky fades from grey to deeper grey to black. Stars emerge, cold and distant. The wind, for once, has eased. The world is still. You can see your breath, each exhalation a small cloud that hangs in the air before dissolving. You can feel the cold seeping through your layers, reclaiming you. But inside the shelter the fire glows. Inside there is warmth, fragile and fleeting but real. You turn, you step back through the flap, back into the smoke and dim light. You lie down beneath the hides, your body heavy with exhaustion, your mind already drifting towards sleep. Tomorrow you will wake and the struggle will begin again. But tonight, for a few precious hours, you rest. As the embers settle and the night deepens around you, let us drift elsewhere in time and space. Not far, perhaps a few valleys over, perhaps a generation or two removed from your own struggle, to a place archaeologists would one day call Malta, near the shores of Lake Baikal in southern Siberia. The journey we take now is one measured not in footsteps but in millennia, not in distance but in understanding, a voyage across the vast ocean of time to touch, however briefly, a life that flickered and faded long before history began to keep its records. Here, approximately 24,000 years ago, when the ice sheet still gripped much of the northern world in their relentless embrace, when the climate oscillated between bitter cold and merely frigid, when the landscape bore little resemblance to the forests and steppes that would one day clothe these lands, a child lived and died. We do not know his name. We cannot hear his voice or know his dreams. We cannot know if he laughed often or cried, if he was brave or timid, clever or slow, beloved by all or challenging to those who cared for him. But we know he existed because his bones remained, cradled in the frozen earth, waiting through millennia to tell their quiet story. The centuries passed over him in darkness. The ice advanced and retreated in its great rhythms. The mammoths he might have seen as a child eventually vanished from the earth entirely. Mountains wore down grain by grain. Rivers changed their courses. Forests grew where tundra had been, and tundra returned where forests had flourished. Human cultures rose and fell, migrated and transformed, forgot and remembered and forgot again. Empires that would have seemed eternal crumbled to dust. Languages evolved, diverged, disappeared. And still the boy lay beneath the earth, his small bones gradually mineralizing, his grave goods settling deeper into the sediment, patient witnesses to a life brief beyond measure, yet preserved beyond all reasonable expectation. Archaeologists discovered him in the 1920s during that fertile period of Soviet archaeology when vast territories previously inaccessible to systematic study were being explored and documented for the first time. They came to the site with their tools and their training, their notebooks and their careful methodologies, not knowing what they would find, but hoping, always hoping, for evidence that would illuminate the distant past. They chose their excavation sites based on surface finds and local knowledge, on the subtle reading of landscape that tells the trained eye where humans might have chosen to settle. And they found what they were looking for, though they could not have anticipated the emotional weight of their discovery. The excavation proceeded slowly, as all good archaeology must. Layer by layer they removed the accumulated sediment of ages. They documented everything: the soil composition, the depth of each find, the spatial relationships between objects. They sifted the earth through screens to catch even the smallest beads and bone fragments. They drew careful maps and took meticulous notes, and gradually the picture emerged of what had once been a substantial winter camp, a place where people had lived and worked and died over many seasons, perhaps over many generations. They found his skeleton, fragile, small, the bones of a boy perhaps 3 or 4 years old, buried with care beneath the floor of a dwelling. His bones were those of a child who had not yet finished growing, whose body had been cut short before it could reach its full potential. The skeletal remains, examined by physical anthropologists, told a story written in calcium and collagen, in the shape of bones and the marks of growth interrupted. His teeth, still a mixture of baby teeth and emerging permanent ones, allowed for estimates of his age. His long bones, not yet fully formed, spoke of a life measured in a handful of seasons. The subtle signs of nutritional stress visible in the bone structure hinted at the hardships his short life had encompassed. Around him lay artifacts that speak across the vast silence of time, carved ivory figurines of extraordinary delicacy and skill, beads of polished stone that had been painstakingly shaped and drilled with stone tools, implements of flint and bone that showed the wear patterns of long use, the remains of hearths where fires had burned to keep the darkness and cold at bay, and the post holes and bone supports that revealed where shelters had once stood. Each object was a testament to human ingenuity, to the investment of time and skill and creative thought that elevated mere survival to something approaching culture, community, meaning. The figurines, in particular, captured the imagination of researchers from the moment they were uncovered. Carved from mammoth ivory with tools of stone, they represented human figures, animal forms, and abstract patterns whose meanings remain tantalizingly obscure. The human figures, often called Venus figurines by archaeologists, displayed the characteristic features seen at sites across Ice Age Europe and Asia: stylized female forms with emphasized hips and breasts, minimal facial features, careful attention to hairstyles or headwear. Some were small enough to fit in the palm of a hand, others were larger, more substantial, clearly objects of importance. Their surfaces bore the polish of handling, the shine that comes from being touched repeatedly over long periods. Were they sacred objects, representations of ancestors or spirits or deities? Were they teaching tools used to instruct the young about the cycles of life and fertility? Were they simply art, the expression of an aesthetic sense that transcended mere utility? The figurines offered no easy answers, only deeper questions. The site itself tells us much about how his people lived, about the daily rhythms and seasonal cycles that structured existence in that harsh landscape. Malta was not a temporary camp, hastily abandoned when game moved on, the kind of ephemeral site that leaves only the faintest traces in the archaeological record. It was a place returned to season after season, a location chosen with care and knowledge accumulated over generations. The sheer volume of artifacts, the depth of the cultural deposits, the evidence of rebuilding and repair all pointed to a site that served as a focal point in the seasonal round, a place that meant something to the people who used it. The river nearby provided water in summer, ice for melting in winter, and a pathway for seasonal migrations of both animals and humans. Rivers were the highways of the ancient world, especially in landscapes where dense vegetation or broken terrain made overland travel difficult. They provided orientation in a world without maps or compasses. They concentrated resources: fish during spawning runs, waterfowl during migrations, mammals coming to drink, plants growing along their fertile banks. The surrounding landscape, though harsh by the standards of temperate zones, though challenging even compared to other regions inhabited during the Ice Age, offered resources for those who knew where and when to find them. Mammoth roamed these lands in herds, their shaggy forms moving across the tundra steppe in seasonal patterns learned over generations. They were dangerous to hunt, certainly, massive animals that could kill a human with a single blow, that required coordinated group effort to bring down, that could just as easily charge and scatter a hunting party as fall to their spears. But a successful mammoth hunt meant an enormous payoff in meat, fat, hide, bone, ivory, sinew, everything a band needed to survive the winter. A single mammoth could feed a group for weeks, provide raw materials for months of manufacture, yield ivory for carving that could last for years. Reindeer moved through in great migrations, their numbers so vast that the sound of their hooves on the frozen ground could be heard from a great distance, that the sight of them covered the landscape like a moving carpet of fur and antler. They were easier to hunt than mammoths, smaller and more vulnerable, their migrations predictable enough that people could position themselves along known routes and take animals with relative ease. Their hides made superior cold-weather clothing, their sinew the strongest thread, their antlers tools and toggles and tent pegs, their every part useful. Fox and hare left tracks in the snow, patterns that trained eyes could read like writing, that told stories of where the animals had been and where they were going. Their furs, though smaller, were valuable for trimming and lining, for mittens and boots and hoods. Their meat added variety to a diet that could otherwise become monotonous. In a world where every calorie counted, where the line between plenty and starvation could shift with the fortunes of a single season, no potential food source was overlooked. Fish, when the waters opened in spring and summer, provided a reliable resource that required different skills than hunting, but offered rich rewards. The salmon runs, in particular, would have been times of relative abundance, when the rivers boiled with fish, moving upstream to spawn, when a person with a spear or a net, or simply quick hands, could take fish after fish until arms ached and baskets overflowed. The fish could be eaten fresh, roasted over fires, or boiled in hide-lined pits heated with hot stones. They could be dried on racks, smoked over slow fires, cached underground to freeze and provide food during the darker months. Berries and roots during the brief summer abundance when the tundra exploded with life offered crucial vitamins and variety. The gathering of plant foods was probably primarily the work of women and children, those whose mobility wasn't restricted by the demands of hunting large game. They would have known every edible plant in their territory, known when each one would be ready, known which roots to dig, and which berries to pick, and which leaves could be chewed or brewed into teas. This botanical knowledge, accumulated over countless generations, represented a vast library of information passed down through observation and instruction, through trial and error, through the careful attention to the natural world that meant the difference between health and deficiency, between strength and weakness. The shelters at Malta were more permanent than many, reflecting both the severity of the climate and the relative stability of resources that allowed people to remain in one location for extended periods. Archaeological remains show the outlines of semi-subterranean dwellings, structures dug partially into the earth for insulation, their walls reinforced with mammoth bones and tusks, their roofs covered with multiple layers of hide. The excavations revealed post holes that had once held wooden supports, now long rotted away, but leaving their ghostly traces in the soil. They revealed the placement of hearths, the arrangement of sleeping areas, the storage pits where food and tools had been kept, the work areas where stone had been knapped and hides had been sewn. Some of these dwellings were large enough to house extended families, spaces where 15 or 20 people might have lived through the long winter months, their lives intimately intertwined by necessity and kinship. The floors showed the packed earth of long occupation, the staining where organic materials had decayed, the scatter of small objects lost or discarded in the daily flow of life. The hearths were carefully constructed, ringed with stones to contain the fire and reflect heat back into the living space, positioned to maximize warmth while minimizing smoke accumulation in the enclosed space. They showed evidence of being cleaned out and rebuilt, of being tended and maintained over many seasons of use. The construction of such shelters would have required enormous labor. The excavation of the semi-subterranean foundation, the gathering and placement of mammoth bones heavy enough to require multiple people to move, the preparation of hides to cover the structure, the installation of smoke holes and entrance passages. But this labor was repaid in the shelter's effectiveness at maintaining livable temperatures even in the depths of winter, at resisting the fierce winds that swept across the open landscape, at providing a secure space where families could gather and children could be kept safe. Imagine the boy's world not as an abstract archaeological site, but as a living, breathing place where real people went about the business of their lives. Imagine him born perhaps in spring, when the harshest cold had finally released its grip, and the days were lengthening perceptibly, when his mother could believe that new life had a chance of surviving to see another season. His mother would have held him close, skin to skin, keeping him warm through those first vulnerable weeks when an infant has no ability to regulate its own temperature, when the world is overwhelming and terrifying, and the only safety is the warmth and smell and heartbeat of the person who carried you. The birth itself would have been attended by the women of the band, those who had themselves given birth and survived, who knew the stages of labor and the ways to assist and comfort. They would have prepared a space near the fire, warm and as clean as could be managed. They would have had their tools ready, blades of obsidian or flint for cutting the umbilical cord, soft scraped hides for wrapping the baby, water heated in hide-lined pits or birch bark containers. They would have known songs to sing, words to say, gestures to make, rituals passed down from their mothers and grandmothers, given meaning by repetition and belief. His mother, exhausted and exhilarated, would have examined him carefully once the birth was complete, and he had drawn his first breath and announced his presence with a cry. She would have counted his fingers and toes, checked that his mouth and eyes and ears were properly formed, looked for any signs of problems that might affect his chances of survival. Finding him whole and healthy enough, she would have put him to her breast for the first time, beginning the process of nursing that would continue for years. That would be his primary source of nutrition for many months, and a supplementary source even after he began to eat solid foods. He would have been nursed frequently those first weeks and months whenever he cried or seemed restless, the act providing not just nutrition, but comfort and security. His mother's milk, rich with the fats and proteins her body could spare, would have given him antibodies and other protective factors that helped his immature immune system cope with the countless pathogens in his environment. The close physical contact of nursing would have helped regulate his temperature and heart rate, would have flooded both mother and child with hormones that promoted bonding and attachment. He would have been swaddled in the softest furs available, wrapped snugly in ways that restricted his movement, but also helped him feel secure, that kept him warm and protected. The furs would have been carefully prepared, scraped and softened until they were supple and gentle against fragile skin. They would have been sewn with tiny, careful stitches, the work of hours bent over the sewing in firelight. They would have been decorated perhaps with beads or quills or patterns dyed into the hide, not for the baby's benefit, who could not yet appreciate such things, but for the pride and love of those who made them. He would have been watched over by the entire band, for in such small communities, every child belongs to everyone. Every child represents hope for the future. Every child is too precious to be left unattended or uncared for. The older women, past their own childbearing years, would have taken particular interest in him, offering advice to his mother, taking him so she could rest or attend to other tasks, singing to him songs that had soothed babies for generations untold. The men, returning from hunts or tool-making sessions, would have stopped to look at him, to marvel at his tiny hands and feet, to imagine him grown and hunting alongside them. The other children in the band would have been curious about him, wanting to touch and hold him, learning through observation and participation the skills they would need when they had children of their own. They would have been taught to be gentle, to support his head, to hand him back if he cried or seemed distressed. They would have competed for the privilege of helping to care for him, of fetching things his mother needed, of entertaining him when he was fussy. As he grew through those first months, his mother would have kept him close constantly, carrying him in a sling or cradleboard when she moved about, laying him on soft furs when she worked at tasks that required both hands. She would have talked to him constantly, sung to him, touched him, the sound of her voice and the warmth of her hands, the constants in his expanding world. She would have responded to his cries and his needs, would have learned to distinguish between his hungry cry and his tired cry and his uncomfortable cry, would have become expert in reading his moods and anticipating his needs. His father, too, would have been present in these early months, though his role would have been different. He would have been responsible for providing the food and resources the family needed, for hunting and fishing and gathering materials. But he would also have held his son, would have felt the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders, would have looked at this tiny, vulnerable creature and understood that everything he did now was for this boy's survival and future. He would have carved toys, perhaps, smooth and safe for small hands. He would have told stories, even though the boy was too young to understand the words, because the sound of his voice and the cadence of storytelling were part of the boy's birthright, part of what would make him fully human. As he grew into his first year, the boy would have begun to change rapidly, the transformation from helpless infant to curious, mobile child proceeding with the speed that characterizes human development. He would have begun to smile socially, responding to faces and voices with expressions of delight that rewarded those who cared for him. He would have begun to reach for objects, to grasp and manipulate things, to explore his world through touch and taste. He would have begun to make sounds, experimenting with his voice, babbling in strings of syllables that gradually would have taken on the patterns and rhythms of his people's language. He would have begun to sit up, to crawl, to pull himself upright while holding on to supports. Each milestone would have been celebrated, marked with the pleasure and pride of his family. Each new skill would have opened new possibilities for interaction and exploration. He would have become more of a person, less of a helpless bundle, someone with preferences and opinions and a will of his own. He would have begun to learn the rhythms of his people's life, absorbing through observation and participation the patterns that structured existence. In summer, there would have been relative plenty, though plenty is always a relative term in subsistence societies where the next meal is never guaranteed. The band might have moved to follow the reindeer herds traveling lighter than in winter, the shelters temporary and easily abandoned, or they might have moved to fishing sites where the salmon ran thick in the rivers, where the work was intensive but the rewards substantial. The boy, old enough by his second summer to walk short distances but still carried much of the time, would have experienced these movements as adventures, new sights and sounds and smells that expanded his understanding of the world. He would have played with other children, the rough and tumble play that builds muscles and coordination, that teaches social skills and boundaries. They would have chased each other through the camp, splashed in shallow water if it was warm enough, examined interesting rocks and plants and insects. They would have imitated the adults, playing at hunting and gathering and tool-making with the seriousness that children bring to their games. They would have learned to walk on the soft tundra grass, their steps gradually becoming more sure and confident. They would have felt the sun, weak but welcome by the standards of more temperate zones, but still a source of warmth and light after the long winter darkness, on their faces. But summer was brief, lasting only a few short months, even at its longest. The window of plant growth and animal abundance was narrow, constrained by the realities of latitude and climate. Always, there was the awareness that winter would return, that the hard times were never truly gone, but only temporarily in abeyance. The adults never fully relaxed, never stopped preparing even in the midst of summer plenty. They dried meat and fish, gathered and stored every resource that could be preserved, worked with an urgency born of experience and the knowledge that a single bad winter could mean the end of everything. By his third or fourth year, the boy would have been old enough to understand the preparations, to sense the tension that accompanied the shortening days of autumn. He would have watched the adults working with urgent purpose as autumn arrived, hunting intensively while the animals were still fat from summer feeding, drying meat over slow fires that had to be tended constantly to keep the smoke steady without generating too much heat, scraping and curing hides in the process that transformed raw skin into supple leather. He would have seen the shelter being reinforced, gaps sealed against winter winds, extra layers of hide being added to walls and roof. He would have seen the caches being filled with dried food, the careful accounting of resources. He would have seen the worry in his elders' faces as they calculated whether they had enough to last until spring, whether they had prepared sufficiently, or whether hunger would stalk them through the dark months. He would have begun, by this age, to have responsibilities of his own. Nothing too demanding, he was still small, still learning, but enough to teach him that he was part of the community, that he had a role to play. He might have been sent to gather small sticks for kindling, to fetch water in a small container he could carry, to watch younger children while adults worked. He would have been praised when he did well, corrected gently when he made mistakes, taught that his contributions mattered even if they were small. The artifacts found near his remains suggest his family had some status, or at least some wealth, though these terms are difficult to apply to societies so different from our own. The carved figurines, small, beautiful representations of women, birds, and abstract forms, would have taken hours, days, perhaps weeks to create, representing an enormous investment of time and skill. They speak of a people who had time and skill for more than mere survival, who could afford to invest labor in beauty, in meaning, in the sacred, rather than the purely practical. They speak of a society complex enough to have specialists, or at least individuals who excelled at particular crafts. They speak of a value system that prized these objects, that gave them importance beyond their practical utility. One figurine in particular has captured the imagination of researchers for decades, becoming in some ways the emblem of the site itself. Delicately carved from mammoth ivory, it depicts a woman's form, stylized and smooth, the curves and proportions exaggerated in ways that scholars continue to debate. The surface is worn by handling, polished by the touch of countless hands, suggesting this was not an object kept carefully stored, but one that was used, touched, passed around. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. The symmetry, the proportion, the attention to detail all speak of a skilled artisan working with stone tools to produce something of genuine aesthetic merit. Was this a sacred object, a representation of an ancestor, or a spirit imbued with power and meaning through ritual and belief? Was it a fertility symbol, used in ceremonies or rituals related to childbirth and the continuation of the band? Was it a teaching tool, a tangible representation used to instruct the young about the human body, about the roles of women, about the mysteries of reproduction? Was it simply art for its own sake, the expression of a creative impulse that needed no justification beyond the desire to make something beautiful? Was it a toy passed from hand to hand by children, worn smooth by play? Scholars have proposed all these interpretations and more, each finding support in some aspect of the artifact or its context, none able to claim definitive proof. We cannot know, but we know the boy would have seen such objects, perhaps touched them, perhaps held them while sitting by the fire on long winter evenings. Perhaps he heard the stories they represented told and retold around the fire, the narratives that gave meaning to abstract forms that connected the present moment to the deep past and the imagined future. Perhaps he asked questions about them, the endless why questions that children ask, and received answers that satisfied his curiosity or provoked new questions. Perhaps he was told these were sacred, not to be treated carelessly, and learned to handle them with the careful reverence that adults demonstrated. His daily life, in those brief years, would have followed patterns familiar to any child of his time and place. Patterns that were both mundane and extraordinary, both tedious and filled with wonder. Rising with the adults in the morning, though allowed to sleep longer than they did, nestled in the warmth of furs while the fire was rebuilt and breakfast prepared. The process of waking would have been gradual, the transition from sleep to full alertness eased by the familiar sounds and smells of the shelter, by the murmur of adult voices and the crackling of the fire, and the smell of food beginning to warm. Eating when food was available, warm broths of meat and marrow, the liquid rich with fat and nutrients, served in containers of hide or birch bark or carefully hollowed wood. Dried fish softened in water, the flesh flaking apart to reveal the rich oils that had been preserved through the drying process. Occasional treats of fat or organ meat that children needed for growth, their developing brains and bodies requiring specific nutrients that only these foods could provide. The eating would have been communal, the band gathered around the fire, the food shared according to complex rules of distribution that ensured everyone received appropriate portions while also honoring obligations and status relationships. Playing with simple toys, smooth pebbles collected from the riverbank, their surfaces worn by water and time until they fit perfectly in small hands. Scraps of hide that could become dolls or animals in the imagination of a child, that could be wrapped and unwrapped, tied and untied in patterns that developed fine motor skills. Small bones arranged in patterns on the floor, games of his own invention or learned from other children, the quiet, focused play that occupied children while adults worked. The play would have been frequently interrupted by adult activity, by the need to move to make room for work or to be taken outside for elimination, or simply because adults in small spaces with children sometimes needed the children to be elsewhere. But within those constraints, play would have been the boy's primary activity, the work of childhood being to learn through exploration and imagination. Learning, always learning, though not through formal instruction of the kind we might recognize. Watching his father or uncle's napstone, sitting close enough to see but far enough to be safe from flying flakes, seeing how a piece of flint could be struck just so to produce a sharp edge, how the angle of the hammerstone and the force of the blow determined the shape and size of the flake removed. The men would have worked with the unconscious competence that comes from years of practice, their hands knowing what to do without conscious thought. But sometimes they would slow down, would exaggerate their movements so the watching boy could see clearly, would hand him a piece of stone to hold and feel the weight and texture of it. Observing his mother or aunts as they sewed, their needles of bone threading sinew through hide with patient precision, the stitches small and even, the work requiring the kind of sustained attention and manual dexterity that took years to develop. They would have let him try sometimes, giving him scraps of hide and blunt needles, praising his clumsy efforts and gently correcting his mistakes. They would have explained what they were doing and why, teaching him the properties of different materials, the purposes of different stitches, the ways that clothing had to be constructed to resist the cold and the wind. Listening to the elders' stories, the narratives that carried the accumulated wisdom of generations, absorbing without fully understanding the deep knowledge embedded in them. Stories of where the herds move and when, the seasonal patterns that repeated year after year, with enough consistency to be predictable, but enough variation to require attention and adjustment. Stories of when the ice breaks on the river, of how to read the weather in the clouds and the wind, of where the best fishing sites are and when the plants are ready for harvest. Stories of which plants heal and which harm, the botanical pharmacy that could ease pain and reduce fever and stop bleeding and purge poisons. Stories of the ancestors, of great hunts and terrible winters, and children born and elders who had died. Stories that located the present moment in a continuum of time, that gave meaning to suffering by placing it in a larger context. The stories would have been told in the long winter evenings when darkness came early and stayed late, when the work was done or could not be done in the dim light, when the band gathered around the fire for warmth and companionship. The firelight would have played across the storyteller's face, animating the expressions, creating shadows that danced on the walls. The voice would have risen and fallen with the rhythm of the narrative, sometimes dramatic, sometimes hushed, sometimes singing or chanting parts of the story that had always been sung or chanted. The boy would have listened with the intensity that children bring to stories, his imagination filling in details, his emotions engaged by the triumphs and tragedies being recounted. But illness came for him, as it came for so many children in that harsh world, that world where perhaps half of all children died before reaching adulthood, where the margin between health and sickness, between life and death, was narrow and easily crossed. The skeletal evidence, examined by specialists who can read bone like others read text, suggests he suffered from nutritional deficiencies, not starvation in the acute sense, not the immediate crisis of having no food at all, but the chronic shortage of certain vital nutrients that left his body struggling, his immune system compromised, his growth stunted. The long winters, lasting 8 or 9 months in that northern latitude, meant long periods with no fresh plant foods, no vegetables or fruits to provide vitamins, no variety to prevent deficiency diseases. The limited diet, heavy on meat and fish but lacking in other essentials, meant that even when there was plenty of calories, there might not be proper nutrition. The body's endless need for energy to stay warm, to maintain core temperature in the face of bitter cold, meant that resources were diverted from growth and maintenance to simple survival, that every calorie had to do double duty. These factors took their toll on the young and the old first, on those whose bodies were most vulnerable, who had the least reserves to draw on when times were hard. The boy's bones showed the telltale signs, the lines of arrested growth where development had paused during periods of hardship, the subtle malformations that spoke of deficiencies during crucial developmental periods, the general indication of a body stressed beyond its capacity to fully compensate. Perhaps it was a respiratory infection, worsened by the smoke-filled shelters where the fire was the only source of heat and light, but also a constant source of irritation to eyes and lungs. The shelters, sealed against the cold, allowed smoke to accumulate despite the best efforts at ventilation. The cold air outside, dry and harsh, would have made breathing difficult even for the healthy. An infection in such conditions could quickly become serious, the lungs filling with fluid, the body unable to get enough oxygen, the fever burning through precious reserves of energy and fat. Perhaps it was an injury that became infected, the body unable to fight off disease in its weakened state. A simple cut or scrape, the kind of minor injury that happens to all active children, could become a gateway for bacteria in a world without antibiotics or antiseptics where the only treatments were plant-based remedies of varying effectiveness. The infection could spread, the wound becoming swollen and hot, the flesh turning colors that meant tissue death, the fever rising as the body fought a battle it was slowly losing. Perhaps it was simply that his small body, struggling through another winter, having made it through 3 or perhaps 4 previous winters, but never quite recovering fully from the deprivations, finally exhausted its reserves and gave up the fight. Perhaps there was no single cause, no dramatic moment of injury or illness, but rather a slow failing, a gradual weakening until one day he simply did not wake up, his small heart having stopped during the night, his last breaths taken in sleep. The manner of his burial tells us he was loved, tells us that even in their grief and their own struggles, his people took time to honor him, to mark his passing with ceremony and care. The band did not simply leave his body for scavengers or expose it to the elements, the expedient disposal that might have been expected in a community where survival was always uncertain and resources were precious. They prepared him carefully, washing his body and wrapping him in hides, perhaps painting him with ochre or other pigments, perhaps dressing him in his best clothes, perhaps adorning him with beads and ornaments that had been his in life or that were made specially for his journey. They placed him beneath the shelter floor, keeping him close, keeping him protected even in death, making him part of the dwelling that had sheltered him in life. The location was not random or expedient, but chosen with purpose. He would be beneath the floor where his family walked and worked and slept, where his presence would be felt even though he was gone, where he would remain part of the community even in death. The excavation into the floor would have required effort, breaking through the packed earth, deepening the hole to accommodate his small body, and the goods buried with him. All this labor undertaken in the midst of winter, when energy was precious and every action had to be weighed against its cost. The artifacts buried with him suggest belief in some form of afterlife, some continuation beyond the cessation of breath. The figurines placed near his body were not random debris but deliberately chosen objects, goods that would have been valuable to the living, but were deemed necessary for the dead. They gave him tools for a journey they believed he would take, equipment for an afterlife they could only imagine, but evidently believed in, strongly enough to sacrifice precious resources. They gave him beauty to carry into the darkness, objects that had meaning and value, that represented the best of what their culture could produce. The burial would have been attended by the entire band, for this was not a private family matter, but a communal loss, a reminder to everyone of their own mortality and the fragility of life. There would have been rituals, words spoken, and gestures made, ceremonies that had been performed at other burials and would be performed at burials yet to come. There would have been grief, expressed in ways that were culturally appropriate, perhaps wailing and the tearing of clothes, perhaps silent weeping, perhaps songs sung in his memory. His mother would have been inconsolable, her loss the most profound. her arms empty of the child they had held so recently. His father would have stood silent perhaps, his grief no less real for being less visibly expressed, his shoulders bearing the weight of failure. For what father does not feel he has failed when he cannot keep his child alive? The other children would have watched with wide eyes, not fully understanding death but sensing its significance, feeling the grief of the adults and being frightened by it, asking questions that could not be fully answered. The elders would have provided what comfort they could, speaking of the cycle of life and death, assuring the grieving parents that the boy's spirit continued somewhere, that they would meet him again in some future existence, that his brief life had meaning even though it had been cut short. The other inhabitants of Malta that winter, those who survived, who mourned him, who filled in the earth over his small body, continued their struggle because there was no alternative, because survival demanded their full attention and effort. They repaired the shelter above his grave, patching the hole they had made, smoothing the floor, returning the living space to functionality. They tended their fires, the constant work of gathering fuel and maintaining the flames that stood between them and freezing. They hunted and foraged and waited for spring, counting the days until the sun would return in strength, until the animals would return from wherever they had gone, until the ice on the river would break and the world would come alive again. And when spring came, finally, after what must have seemed an eternity of darkness and cold, when the days lengthened and the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in months, when the snow began to melt and trickle away in 1,000 small streams, they moved on following the herds, following the season's promise of renewal. They left the winter camp behind, left the boy beneath the floor, left that place of hardship and loss, and moved toward the hope that summer represented. But they remembered. They carried the memory with them in their hearts, told stories of him around new fires in new camps, kept him alive in narrative even though his body lay still and cold in the earth. They returned. The evidence shows Malta was occupied repeatedly over centuries, that this was not a place used once and forgotten, but a location that held significance, that called people back, generation after generation. Perhaps his family came back season after season, rebuilding the shelter, tending new fires, bearing new children who played where he had played. Perhaps they told stories of the winter they lost the child, stories that became part of the site's memory, woven into the landscape itself, passed down through generations until the specific details were forgotten. But the sense of loss and love remained, embedded in the very earth. Perhaps other families came, drawn by the same practical considerations that had made Malta attractive to the boy's people, the river, the sheltered location, the convergence of game trails, the proximity to resources. Perhaps they knew nothing of the boy buried beneath one of the dwelling floors. Or perhaps they did know. Perhaps his grave became part of the site's significance, a reminder of those who had come before, a connection to ancestors and tradition. Perhaps they added their own dead to the place over the centuries, creating a necropolis of sorts, a place where the living and the dead existed in close proximity, where the boundaries between past and present, between memory and lived experience, became permeable and fluid. The site grew richer with each occupation, layers of cultural material accumulating like pages in a book, each layer telling its own story while also contributing to the larger narrative. New hearths were built atop old ones, new tools were made and used and discarded, falling to the floor to be trampled into the earth, to be covered by sediment and forgotten. New figurines were carved, new beads were strung, new children were born and grew, and eventually died in their turn. The cycle continued, the great wheel of human existence turning through seasons and years and generations, each rotation similar to the last, yet subtly different, each cohort of humans facing the same fundamental challenges, yet bringing their own innovations and adaptations to the eternal problems of survival and meaning. And then, gradually, the occupation ceased. Perhaps the climate shifted enough that Malta became less favorable, the game moving elsewhere, the river changing its course, the winter winds becoming even harsher. Perhaps the human population in the region declined, whether through disease or warfare, or simply the gradual drift of migration that moved people elsewhere. Perhaps other sites became more attractive, or new technologies made different locations more viable. The reasons vanish into the silence of the past, but the result is clear. Malta was eventually abandoned for the last time, left to the elements and to the slow processes of natural burial. The shelters collapsed gradually, their supporting posts rotting away, their hide coverings torn by wind and consumed by insects and bacteria, their mammoth bone framework settling into the earth. Snow fell and melted, each cycle adding a thin layer of sediment. Plants grew and died, their roots penetrating the cultural deposits, their decay adding organic matter to the soil. Animals burrowed and nested in the ruins, disturbing some areas while leaving others remarkably intact. The site slowly disappeared beneath the accumulating earth, becoming invisible to surface observation, known only to the land itself and to whatever spirits or memories might linger in such places. Thousands of years later, when the earth finally released his bones to human eyes again, when the archaeologists carefully excavated the site and documented everything they found, he became something else, a window into the past, a fragment of evidence, a small voice speaking across impossible distance. The boy who had been a son, a brother perhaps, a member of a community, a child with his own personality and preferences and potential, became MA1 in the archaeological literature, a designation that reduced him to a specimen, even as it preserved his memory and made him famous in a way he could never have imagined. The archaeologists who found him, who carefully excavated his remains and the artifacts surrounding him, who documented everything with photographs and drawings and detailed notes, could not have known his name or heard his laughter or understood the specifics of his life. They could not resurrect him, could not speak with him, could not undo the tragedy of his early death. But they could read the story written in bone and stone and ivory, could interpret the material remains to construct a picture of his world, could use their scientific methods and their careful reasoning to breathe a kind of life back into the distant past. They could see the care with which he was treated, the deliberateness of his burial, the investment of resources and labor that spoke of love and grief and belief in something beyond the material world. They could see the harsh realities of his world in the evidence of nutritional stress, in the small size of his bones, in the very fact of his early death. They could see the ingenuity and resilience of his people in the sophisticated construction of the shelters, in the skilled manufacture of tools and ornaments, in the successful adaptation to one of the harshest environments humans have ever inhabited. They could see in the delicate carvings left behind evidence of an inner life, of imagination, of spirituality, of aesthetic sense, of the very human need to create meaning in a cold and dangerous world. The figurines, in particular, opened windows into the minds of Ice Age people that few other artifacts could match. Unlike tools, which could be understood primarily in functional terms, the figurines demanded interpretation at the level of meaning and symbolism. They spoke of a capacity for abstract thought, for representation, for the manipulation of symbols that is one of the defining characteristics of human cognition. They spoke of leisure time, however limited, that could be devoted to activities beyond immediate survival. They spoke of value systems that prized these objects highly enough to bury them with the dead, removing them permanently from circulation among the living. Modern analysis of the boy's remains has revealed even more information than the original excavators could have extracted. DNA analysis, impossible in the 1920s but routine today, has told us about his genetic relationships, placing him in the context of ancient human migrations and population movements. His DNA contains signatures that link him to both European and Asian populations, supporting theories about the complex patterns of human movement during the Ice Age. Isotope analysis of his teeth and bones has revealed information about his diet, about where he lived at different stages of his short life, about the weaning process and the foods he consumed. Every analytical technique brought to bear on his remains has added another layer of understanding, another detail to the picture of his life and world. Yet for all this scientific knowledge, for all the data that can be extracted from his bones and teeth and DNA, he remains fundamentally mysterious. We can know what he ate, but not what he enjoyed eating. We can know that he was cared for, but not how he felt about those who cared for him. We can know that he died young, but not whether he was afraid at the end or peaceful, whether he understood what was happening or slipped away in confused suffering. We can know that he was buried with grave goods, but not what he would have thought about that, whether he would have been pleased or indifferent or completely uncomprehending. The inner life, the subjective experience, the consciousness that made him a person rather than just a biological organism. These remain forever beyond our reach, separated from us by the unbridgeable gulf of death and time. The boy from Malta lived only a few years, perhaps 3 or 4 winters at most, a span of time that seems tragically brief by the standards of modern life expectancy. But through his remains, through the artifacts that surrounded him, through the shelter that protected him in life and held him in death, he tells us something essential about what it meant to be human in the depths of the Ice Age. He becomes a representative, an exemplar, standing in for the countless other children who lived and died in similar circumstances, but left no trace that archaeologists could find, whose bones were scattered or destroyed, or lie still undiscovered in the frozen earth. He tells us that survival was never merely physical, never just a matter of obtaining sufficient calories and avoiding immediate dangers. Yes, the shelters were critical, the carefully constructed dwellings of bone and hide that kept the wind at bay and held the fire's warmth, the engineered spaces that made survival possible in temperatures that could kill an unprotected human in minutes. Yes, the clothing mattered, the carefully sewn garments of layered furs that created dead air spaces for insulation, that protected extremities from frostbite, that could mean the difference between returning from a hunt and freezing to death in a blizzard. Yes, the food stores mattered, the dried meat and fish that represented the labor of summer and autumn, that stood between the band and starvation during the long months when hunting was difficult and gathering was impossible. Yes, all the material necessities of life in the cold were crucial, and failure in any of these areas could be fatal. But humans also needed beauty, needed it not as a luxury that could be dispensed with in hard times, but as something fundamental to human experience. They needed stories that made sense of their suffering, that placed their struggles in a larger context of meaning and purpose, that connected them to their ancestors and to the future generations they hoped would continue after they were gone. They needed rituals to mark the passages of life and death, ceremonies that acknowledged the significance of birth and coming of age and marriage and passing, that gave structure to existence and meaning to the inevitable transitions. They needed art to express what words perhaps could not, visual and tactile representations of ideas and feelings and experiences that exceeded the capacity of language to capture. They needed community, connection, the knowledge that they were part of something larger than their individual struggle, that their lives mattered to others, that they would be remembered and mourned when they died. The boy's short life and careful burial exemplify this fundamental truth about human nature. His people, struggling daily with cold and hunger and danger, with the constant threat of death from exposure or starvation or accident or predation, still took time to carve figurines from mammoth ivory, still invested precious hours that could have been spent in purely practical activities in the creation of objects whose value was primarily symbolic or aesthetic or spiritual. still took time to prepare him for burial with ceremony and care, to dig through the frozen ground, to wrap his body in the best materials they had, to place valuable objects with him that could have been used by the living. Still invested labor and resources in honoring his memory, in marking his passing as an event of significance rather than simply another death in a world where death was common. This is what makes us human, perhaps more than any specific physical characteristic or cognitive ability. Not merely our capacity to survive, which we share with countless other species, but our insistence on living, on finding meaning, creating beauty, loving one another even when the world is hard and the cold seems endless. Not merely our ability to solve practical problems, though we excel at that, but our tendency to create problems beyond the practical, to ask why rather than just how, to care about things that have no immediate survival value, but that make life worth living. The boy's people could have simply disposed of his body and moved on. They could have put all their energy into surviving the rest of that winter and preparing for the next. They could have been purely practical, purely pragmatic, concerned only with the material challenges of existence, but they were not. They were human, fully and completely, and that meant they cared about things beyond survival. It meant they invested resources in ritual and ceremony. It meant they created art and told stories and believed in things they could not see or touch or prove. It meant they loved their children enough to honor them in death, even when the living struggled daily with the possibility of their own deaths. As we leave the boy's grave in our imagination, as we picture the band moving on into spring and the years that followed, we carry this knowledge with us into our own time and our own struggles. The struggle was real for them, terrifyingly real in ways that most modern humans in developed nations can barely comprehend. The hardship was immense, the kind of grinding, daily, life-threatening hardship that tested every individual and every community to their limits and beyond. Death came often and early, taking children like this boy before they could even begin to live, taking adults in their prime when they were most needed, taking elders whose knowledge was irreplaceable. Life expectancy was short, infant mortality was high, and everyone lived with the constant awareness that this winter, this hunt, this day might be their last. But humanity persisted not just in body but in spirit, not just surviving but living in the fullest sense of the word, not just enduring but creating. They made art in the face of death. They told stories in the depths of winter. They loved their children fiercely, even knowing how likely they were to lose them. They believed in something beyond the immediate and the material, whether we call it religion or spirituality or simply hope. They found reasons to continue when continuing seemed impossible, found meaning in suffering, found beauty in a world that was often harsh and unforgiving. Their persistence, their refusal to be reduced to mere survival, their insistence on remaining fully human, even in the most dehumanizing circumstances, this is their legacy. This is what the boy from Malta represents beyond the scientific data that can be extracted from his bones. He represents the indomitable human spirit, the capacity to love and create and believe and hope, even when all rational calculation would suggest despair. He represents every child who has ever lived briefly and died too young, every parent who has ever grieved an impossible loss, every community that has ever struggled against overwhelming odds and somehow persevered. And somewhere beneath the earth near Lake Baikal, in the land that archaeologists call Malta, but that had another name in his own language, a name we will never know, the boy still rests. His bones, mineralized now, transformed by time and chemistry, from organic tissue into something more like stone, lie in their original position, or perhaps in museum storage, depending on what became of the remains after excavation. His treasures, the figurines and beads and tools that were buried with him, sit in museum cases or archives, catalogued and studied, their surfaces no longer touched by believing hands, but by latex-gloved researchers who handle them with care but cannot feel what they meant. His bones and his treasures speak softly in a voice that can only be heard by those who know how to listen, by those who can look at ancient objects and see not just artifacts, but the hands that made them, the lives that used them, the beliefs that gave them meaning. They tell the story of winter survived, of the long, dark months when the band huddled in their shelter and wondered if they would see another spring. They tell the story of love expressed, of parents who cared for their child with devotion and buried him with honor when care was not enough to keep him alive. They tell the story of a life that mattered despite its brevity, of a boy who lived only a few years, but who was valued enough that his people gave him the best burial they could manage, who was remembered long enough that his grave was not disturbed, who was cared for in death as he had been in life. The fire burns low in our imagination, the fire that has been a constant companion through this narrative, the fire that stood between Ice Age humans and death, that provided warmth and light and a gathering place for community. The flames flicker and dance, casting shadows that seem to move with a life of their own, that seem almost to take shapes. Human figures, animal forms, abstract patterns that suggest meaning just beyond the reach of understanding. The embers glow red and orange, pulsing like a heartbeat, gradually fading as the night deepens around us. The night deepens, that long night that is both literal, the Arctic winter night that lasts for months, that tests everything and everyone, and metaphorical, the darkness of forgetting, of time passing, of lives lived and lost and forgotten. But against that darkness, small lights persist, the fires in ancient shelters, the memories in human hearts, the stories told and retold around countless hearths across countless generations, the art created not for survival, but for meaning, the love that persists despite knowing how temporary everything is, how fragile life is, how certain death is in the end. And we drift onward, deeper, into the mysteries of the past, carrying with us the lessons the boy from Malta has taught us. We drift through time and space, through the vast landscape of human history, through the millions of lives lived and lost, each one unique, each one valuable, each one telling some part of the larger story of what it means to be human. We drift with wonder and sadness, with respect and curiosity, with the knowledge that we too are part of this story, that we too will one day be bones and artifacts, that we too are living in what will someday be the distant past. The boy from Malta reminds us that every life matters, that every death is a tragedy, that every burial represents love and loss and the human refusal to accept that death has the final word. He reminds us that our ancestors were not primitive or simple or less human than we are, but rather fully human in all the ways that matter, facing challenges we can barely imagine with courage and creativity and the fundamental human capacities for love and meaning-making. He reminds us that we are all connected across time, that the emotions we feel are the same emotions felt by a mother beside Lake Baikal 24,000 years ago, that the human heart has not changed, even as human circumstances have transformed beyond recognition. As his story ends, or rather as our telling of his story ends, for the story itself continues in the bones and artifacts that persist, in the archaeological reports and DNA analyses and scholarly articles that keep his memory alive in academic discourse, in narratives like this one that try to see past the data to the lived experience, to the real child who once existed. We are left with questions as much as answers. We are left wondering what he would think of being remembered this way, of becoming famous 24 millennia after his death, of having his DNA analyzed and his bones measured and his story told to people he could never have imagined. We are left wondering whether he would be pleased or disturbed, proud or uncomfortable, whether he would recognize himself in our reconstructions or find them completely alien to his actual experience. But mostly we are left with gratitude. Gratitude that his bones survived, that the frozen earth preserved them through all those millennia, that the archaeologists found them and recognized their significance, that the specialists studied them and extracted information that illuminates not just his life, but the lives of all Ice Age people. Gratitude for the window into the past that he provides, for the opportunity to see across the vast distance of time and understand something of how our ancestors lived and died and found meaning in their struggles. Gratitude for the reminder that human resilience and creativity and love are not modern inventions but ancient inheritances, characteristics that go back to the very origins of our species and perhaps beyond. The boy from Malta lived and died in a world almost unimaginably different from our own, but he was human as we are human. He felt cold as we feel cold. He needed warmth and food and love as we need warmth and food and love. He played and learned and grew as children have always done. He suffered and died as we all must eventually die. And he was mourned by people who loved him, who felt the same grief at his loss that we feel when we lose our children, whose tears 24,000 years ago were no less real or painful than tears shed today. In the end, his story is our story. His life, however brief, is part of the vast tapestry of human existence, one thread among billions, easily overlooked but no less essential for that. His death reminds us of our mortality, of the fragility of life, of how much can be lost in an instant. His burial reminds us of our humanity, of our capacity to love beyond death, to create meaning in the face of meaninglessness, to insist that lives matter even when the universe seems indifferent. And so we leave him there, beneath the earth near Lake Baikal, still resting after 24,000 years, still teaching anyone willing to learn, still speaking in his quiet way about what it meant and means and will always mean to be human. The fire has burned down to embers. The night is fully upon us. But somewhere in the darkness a small light still shines, the light of memory, of story, of the human refusal to let death have the final word. The boy from Malta is gone, has been gone for longer than we can truly comprehend, but he is not forgotten. And in that persistence of memory across impossible distance, in that connection across the vast gulf of time, there is something beautiful and true and fundamentally hopeful about the human condition. Let us float now into deeper waters, into the questions that linger like frost on winter glass. Questions about how these people truly lived, what they believed, what secrets their shelters held that have dissolved with time into earth and air. These are not the tidy questions of measurement and classification, not the queries that yield to scientific method and careful analysis. These are the questions that haunt, that whisper in the spaces between facts, that remind us how much has been lost to the consuming appetite of time. The archaeological record offers us fragments, glimpses, shadows on the wall of a cave. We can measure post holes and hearthstones, catalogue beads and bone tools, reconstruct the approximate shape of a dwelling from the stains left in soil. We can count the mammoth bones, analyze their positioning, determine with reasonable certainty how they were arranged to form walls and roofs. We can examine wear patterns on stone tools, chemical signatures in ancient sediments, isotopes in bone collagen that reveal diet and movement patterns. But there are spaces between the facts, gaps filled with mystery, where our understanding fades into supposition and wonder. These gaps are not failures of archaeology, but rather monuments to all that cannot be excavated, the textures of lived experience, the content of thoughts, the meanings that people made of their world. Consider first the shelters themselves, these structures that meant the difference between life and death, these circles of bone and hide that held back the annihilating cold. At sites across the Mammoth Steppe, from the Dnieper River valleys to Lake Baikal, from the plains of what is now Czech Republic to the frozen expanses of Siberia, archaeologists have found evidence of dwelling structures built primarily from the bones of mammoths. Not just occasional bones used opportunistically when they happened upon a carcass, not scattered skeletal elements employed as expedient tools, but deliberate architectural assemblies, skulls forming foundations, carefully positioned to create level bases, long bones arranged as supports in patterns that repeat from site to site, tusks curved into frames that suggest shared knowledge of engineering principles, ribs interlocking to create walls with a logic and precision that speaks of practiced expertise handed down through generations. Some of these structures were enormous, far larger than mere pragmatism would require. At Mezherish in Ukraine, excavations revealed dwellings that used bones from more than 90 individual mammoths. 90. Let that number settle in the mind. The sheer labor involved in collecting, transporting, and assembling such massive elements staggers the imagination even now, even with our machinery and our comfortable distance from physical hardship. A mammoth skull can weigh several hundred pounds, 300, 400, perhaps more, for a large adult male. A femur, a tusk, a pelvis, each piece a burden requiring multiple people to move, to drag across frozen ground or through snow, to lift and position with care. Some of these bones came from ancient kilns, weathered and scattered across the landscape, requiring search and salvage. Others were fresh, still greasy with fat and tissue, taken from recent hunts that themselves represented enormous investments of risk and effort. Why bones? The practical answer is straightforward enough, almost too obvious to need stating. In the treeless tundra steppe, wood was scarce or entirely absent. What few trees existed, willows clinging to watercourses, stunted birches in sheltered ravines, were small, gnarled and precious beyond measure. They could not provide the structural elements for dwellings, but bones were abundant, scattered across the plains wherever mammoths had died. They were durable, resistant to the gnawing of weather and time. They were heavy enough to anchor structures against fierce winds that could reach hurricane force, winds that would tear apart any lighter construction and scatter it across the steppe. They did not rot quickly in the cold, that profound cold that acted as a preservative, slowing decay to a geological pace. They could be reused, reconfigured, passed from one season's camp to the next, components of our architectural tradition that spanned generations. But there are mysteries here that practical explanations do not quite resolve, puzzles that nag at the edges of functionalist interpretation. Some mammoth bone dwellings show evidence of careful selection and arrangement that goes beyond mere functionality, that speaks to aesthetic choice or symbolic meaning, or both intertwined in ways we cannot quite pass. Bones painted with ochre, red and yellow pigments laboriously ground from iron-rich minerals, mixed with fat or blood or some other medium to create paint, applied with intention and care, creating patterns that might have been decoration, or might have been communication, or might have been prayer. Skulls positioned at entrances facing outward, as if standing guard, their empty eye sockets staring at approaching visitors or departing inhabitants, or the endless sweep of the steppe beyond. Specific bones placed in specific positions, repeated from site to site in ways that suggest cultural convention or ritual significance, left shoulder blades on the eastern wall, right femurs supporting the roof peak, mandibles flanking the doorway. These patterns are too consistent to be accidental, too widespread to be individual quirks, yet their meaning remains opaque. Were these shelters simply buildings, utilitarian protection against elements that would kill in hours if not held at bay? Or were they also statements, proclamations of identity and achievement visible to anyone who approached the camp? Were they monuments, displays of the band's hunting prowess and collective labor, ways of saying to neighbors and rivals and potential marriage partners, "Look what we can do, see how strong we are, how successful, how favored by fortune or spirits or skill"? Were they sacred spaces, the bones of powerful animals transformed into protective walls, the spirits of mammoths enlisted to guard against the cold and the predators and the malevolent forces that people imagined prowling the darkness? Did the builders believe they were creating not just shelter but sanctuary, not just houses but temples, spaces where the boundary between human and animal, between material and spiritual, became permeable and negotiable? We do not know. We can only wonder, turning the possibilities over in our minds like smooth stones, examining them from different angles, finding no certainty but much room for speculation. The question of how warm these shelters actually were remains partially unresolved, subject to estimate and extrapolation rather than direct measurement. Modern reconstructions and thermal studies, experiments conducted by dedicated archaeologists who built replica mammoth bone huts and spent frigid nights inside them, suggest that such a dwelling, properly insulated with layered hides, perhaps 3 or 4 thicknesses, the innermost scraped thin and supple, the outer ones left with hair intact for maximum insulation, and banked with earth or snow packed around the base to seal drafts, could maintain an internal temperature significantly above freezing, even when the external temperature dropped to lethal cold, to 30 or 40 degrees below zero, to temperatures that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. The fire at the center would radiate heat, of course, its warmth spreading through the enclosed space. The body warmth of inhabitants, 8 or 10 or 12 people pressed together, would contribute perhaps 500 watts of heat per person, the equivalent of a small space heater for each body. The insulation of furs worn as clothing and spread as blankets, the elevation of sleeping platforms above the cold sink of the floor, the reduced interior volume that meant less space to heat, all these factors contributed to survivability. But how well were the hides sealed in practice, not in careful reconstruction but in daily reality, when winds tore at seams and cold found every gap? How much smoke accumulated in the upper reaches of the dwelling, that toxic soup of particulates and carbon monoxide and all the byproducts of incomplete combustion? How much heat escaped through the roof vent necessary to prevent suffocation, that crucial opening that drew fresh air in and smoke out but also bled precious warmth into the night sky? The answers vary depending on construction quality, on the skill and experience of the builders, on maintenance and repair, on weather conditions that might range from merely severe to utterly deadly, and on the size of the dwelling and the number of occupants generating heat and consuming oxygen. Some nights would have been almost comfortable, the fire burning bright, the hides intact, the wind calm, the temperature merely brutal rather than catastrophic. Others would have been merely survivable, a grinding ordeal of cold that never quite killed, but left inhabitants shivering through the darkness, counting the hours until dawn, burning through precious fuel to keep the fire alive, accepting the smoke and the carbon monoxide headaches as the price of not freezing. The floors of these dwellings hold their own mysteries, their own suggestions of practices and beliefs that have left only the faintest traces. At many sites, archaeologists have found evidence of deliberate floor treatment. Layers of ash and charcoal spread across the interior, creating a dark, slightly raised surface that covered the natural earth. Why? The question seems simple, but the answers multiply. Perhaps for insulation, creating a barrier between cold earth that could suck away body heat through conduction and the sleeping bodies of inhabitants. Perhaps for drainage, the ash acting as a desiccant, absorbing moisture from breath and bodies and melting snow brought in on clothing and boots, keeping the living surface dry. Perhaps for light absorption, the dark surface retaining what little warmth could be gained from the low winter sun slanting through the entrance during the brief hours of daylight. Perhaps for cleanliness, the ash acting as a primitive deodorizer and sanitizer, covering organic waste and suppressing odors in a space where privacy was impossible and sanitation was a constant challenge. Or perhaps there were reasons we cannot imagine, cultural or spiritual significance to the act of preparing the floor just so, spreading ash in patterns that may have had cosmological meaning, marking the space as transformed from raw earth into human dwelling, from wilderness into hearth, from outside to inside, in a way that was not just physical, but metaphorical and sacred. Perhaps the ash was seen as purifying, as absorbing not just moisture, but malevolent influences, spiritual contamination, bad luck that might cling to people or objects. Perhaps its dark color had symbolic resonance, the color of charred bone, of the pupil of the eye, of the night sky, of the earth itself, when the snow melted in spring. We find the ash, we measure its depth and extent, we analyze its chemical composition, but we cannot know what it meant to the people who spread it. Fire was, of course, the heart of everything, the center around which all other elements of survival organized themselves. Without fire, survival was impossible, full stop, end of discussion. At temperatures common on the Mammoth steppe in winter, an unprotected human would die of hypothermia in hours, perhaps faster, if wind and wet combined to accelerate heat loss. Fire meant life, warmth and light and cooked food, and the ability to thaw frozen clothing, to melt snow for water, to soften hides for working, to harden spear points, to keep predators at bay. But fire in an enclosed space presents problems that modern people with our chimneys and ventilation systems and building codes and carbon monoxide detectors rarely consider or understand. Smoke is toxic, genuinely and seriously poisonous. Prolonged exposure causes respiratory damage that accumulates over years, scarring of lung tissue, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, increased susceptibility to pneumonia and other infections. It causes eye problems, the constant irritation leading to chronic inflammation, corneal damage, reduced vision. It produces chronic coughs that never quite heal, bronchitis that becomes a permanent condition, throats raw and inflamed from breathing, particulates day after day, year after year. Modern studies of people who live with indoor smoke in the developing world, in traditional dwellings without chimneys, document serious health impacts, reduced life expectancy, quality of life diminished by constant respiratory distress. Yet the skeletal remains from this period show that people lived for years, even decades, breathing smoke daily. They survived, clearly, but at what cost? They adapted physiologically and culturally, finding ways to manage the danger. Perhaps they developed some degree of tolerance, their bodies adjusting to constant low-level carbon monoxide exposure, their respiratory systems becoming more resistant to irritation through sheer necessity. Perhaps selection pressures favored individuals with certain genetic variants that conferred better smoke tolerance, natural selection operating at a pace measured in generations. Perhaps they simply accepted the damage as inevitable, the coughing and the watering eyes and the reduced lung capacity as normal parts of existence, the price paid for not freezing. Some shelters show evidence of sophisticated smoke management, carefully positioned vents at multiple locations, creating air currents that drew smoke upward and out rather than letting it pool at ceiling level, multiple hearths placed to control airflow in complex ways that suggest accumulated knowledge and deliberate design, vestibules or entrance passages that created air pressure differences to draw smoke upward and out without creating drafts that would chill the inhabitants. Others seem to have relied on simpler methods, keeping the fire small, just large enough to provide necessary heat, but not so large as to produce overwhelming smoke, using only the driest fuel available because wet or green wood produces far more smoke than dry, accepting the smoke as the inevitable price of warmth and adjusting behavior and expectations accordingly. Perhaps on particularly bad days, when smoke accumulated dangerously, people simply evacuated the shelter for periods, standing outside in furs and returning when conditions improved, a practice that would leave no archaeological trace but might have been routine. There are hints, too, of spiritual or ritual dimensions to fire, suggestions that it was not merely a utilitarian tool, but something charged with meaning, a phenomenon that demanded respect or propitiation or interaction beyond the merely practical. At some sites, hearths contain unusual materials, crystals placed in the ash, fragments of rare minerals that had no obvious functional purpose, bones arranged in patterns around the fire pit in ways that seemed too deliberate to be casual disposal. Were these offerings? Prayers made tangible, gifts given to the fire or to spirits believed to inhabit or control flame. Methods of communicating with powers beyond human comprehension, attempts to ensure the fire would continue to burn, to provide warmth and light and life? Or were they something else entirely, markers of special occasions, commemorations of events or individuals, practices whose meaning was rich and complex to participants, but which have become entirely opaque across the gulf of millennia? The placement of hearths within dwellings varies in ways that may reflect more than practical considerations of heat distribution and smoke management. Some are perfectly centered, the geometric middle of the circular floor plan, equidistant from all walls, the obvious optimal position for radiating heat evenly throughout the space. Others are offset toward the entrance, perhaps to provide warmth to people entering cold from outside, or perhaps to create a thermal gradient that allowed inhabitants to choose their comfort level, moving closer or farther from the fire as needed. Still others are positioned toward the back wall, away from the entrance, protecting the fire from draft and creating a warmer zone in the deepest part of the dwelling. Some shelters have multiple small hearths distributed around the interior, a configuration that suggests different functional zones, one fire for cooking, another for heat, perhaps a third for light during detailed work, like tool-making or hide sewing. Each choice affects heat distribution, obviously, but also smoke flow, light patterns that would have shaped visibility and the ability to work at different tasks, and the social dynamics of who sits where and who controls access to the fire's warmth and utility. Did families gather around the fire in prescribed positions, elders in one place enjoying the warmest spot as their due, children in another, where they could be watched but wouldn't crowd the best positions, visitors somewhere else, their placement communicating their status and the nature of their relationship to the host band? Were there ritual meanings to proximity to flame, symbolic or religious significance to which side of the hearth one occupied, beliefs about who should tend the fire and who should not? We see hints of such patterns in the distribution of artifacts, tools clustered in certain areas suggesting work zones, worn patches on floor surfaces indicating where people sat or slept repeatedly, but the full meaning, the rich texture of social protocol and spiritual belief eludes us. We can map the material traces but cannot resurrect the lived experience, the emotional weight of sitting in one's proper place or the unease of sitting where one should not. Another mystery that pervades these sites, the decorated objects found in and around these shelters, the carved figurines and beaded ornaments and engraved bones, the artifacts that speak to aesthetic impulse and symbolic thought, and the human need to create meaning through material culture. What role did these play in daily life? Were they constantly present, handled and viewed regularly, integrated into routine activities? Or were they reserved for special occasions, brought out only for rituals or ceremonies, hidden away otherwise in pouches or boxes or cached in special locations? The famous Venus figurines, small carved representations of women, often with exaggerated features, breasts and hips and bellies, emphasized while faces remain blank or minimally indicated, legs and arms reduced to stumps or absent entirely. have been found at sites across the Mammoth steppe, scattered from France to Siberia, spanning thousands of years of human occupation. Some are tiny, palm-sized or smaller, easily carried in a pouch or pocket, portable across any distance. Others are larger, heavier, clearly meant to remain in place or carried only during deliberate moves, substantial objects with weight and presence. Some show signs of extensive handling, their surfaces worn smooth by countless touches, the stone or ivory polished by oil from human hands, suggesting they were held and rubbed and caressed repeatedly over years or decades. Others appear hardly touched at all, preserved in near-pristine condition, their surfaces still showing the fine marks of the carving tools, suggesting they were made and then set aside, displayed perhaps but not handled, looked at but not touched. Were they sacred objects, representations of goddesses or ancestral spirits, images of supernatural beings who controlled fertility or hunting success or the weather? Were they fertility symbols in the most literal sense, charms to ensure successful births in a world where childbirth was desperately dangerous, where maternal mortality must have been high, where every pregnancy was a gamble with death? Were they portraits, attempts to capture the likeness of real women, mothers, leaders, elders beloved and remembered, individuals whose features and forms were preserved in stone and bone so they could be remembered after death? Were they simply art, the human impulse to create beauty, expressing itself in ivory and stone, aesthetic objects made for the pleasure of making them and looking at them, divorced from any specific religious or practical function? Each theory has its advocates, archaeologists and anthropologists who marshal evidence and argument, who point to parallels in ethnographic literature or psychological studies or evolutionary theory. None can be proven with certainty. The figurines keep their secrets, silent and enigmatic across the millennia, open to interpretation but refusing to confirm any single reading. They are what we make of them, mirrors in which we see our own assumptions about gender and religion and art and the human condition. Some of these carved objects were found deliberately placed within the structure of shelters, tucked into wall crevices where bones joined, creating small niches, buried beneath floor layers during construction or renovation, positioned near hearths where they would be visible to people gathered around the fire, or placed near entranceways where they would greet anyone entering or departing. This suggests intentional placement, choices made about where objects belonged, systems of meaning that assign significance to location and context. Perhaps they were protective talismans, objects believed to ward off danger, or bad luck or spiritual threats positioned at vulnerable points, entrances where malevolent forces might enter, the floor beneath which earth spirits might dwell, the hearth where fire spirits were invoked. Perhaps they were offerings to household spirit, gifts given to supernatural entities believed to inhabit or protect the dwelling, rent paid for the privilege of occupying this space. Perhaps they were markers of ownership or identity, ways of saying, this is our home, we are this particular band or family. These objects embody who we are and what we believe. At Malta in Siberia, where our young boy was buried with such care, excavators found numerous such figurines and decorated objects scattered across the site. Some were near the hearths, positioned where they would be visible during evening gatherings. Some were near the burial itself, placed with the dead child or in the fill that covered his grave. Some were scattered as if dropped or discarded, found in refuse areas or in random locations that suggest they were lost or abandoned. The patterns are tantalizing but ambiguous, promising meaning but withholding certainty. What rituals were performed here? What beliefs shaped how objects were made, used, moved from place to place, and eventually deposited in the archaeological record? We can describe what we find, but explaining what it meant requires speculation that can never be verified. The question of how shelters were oriented adds another layer of mystery, another dimension along which choices were made that may have carried significance beyond the merely practical. Many mammoth bone dwellings and hide tent structures show consistent orientation, entrances facing particular directions, often south or southeast, alignments repeated from site to site in ways that suggest cultural convention or shared knowledge. The practical explanation is clear and compelling. Southern exposure maximizes solar warming during the brief winter days when the sun traces a low arc across the southern sky, those few hours of weak sunlight that nonetheless provide some warmth and much-needed light, and entrances facing away from prevailing northern winds reduce heat loss, preventing cold air from blasting directly into the dwelling every time someone enters or exits. But some sites show different patterns, orientations that don't fit the simple practical model. Entrances facing water sources even when those sources lie to the north, suggesting that access to water trumped solar heating in decision-making. Entrances facing particular landmarks, distinctive rocks, prominent hills, river bends or confluences that may have had cultural or spiritual significance. Entrances that seem to align with solar or lunar positions at specific times of year, the winter solstice when the sun reaches its southernmost point, the spring equinox when day and night become equal, the summer solstice when the sun barely sets, creating those strange bright nights of high-latitude summer. Some alignments are so precise they seem unlikely to be accidental. Angles measured to fractions of a degree, orientations that would require careful observation and deliberate construction. Were these astronomical alignments intentional? Did these people track the movements of sun and stars and moon with precision, knowledge accumulated over generations through careful observation, encoded into the very architecture of their homes? Did they see cosmological significance in these celestial movements, spiritual meaning in the sun's annual journey north and south, the moon's phases, the wheeling of stars around the polar sky? Or are the alignments coincidental, products of chance and our modern mind's tendency to find patterns where none were intended, our own astronomical knowledge projected backward onto people who may have had entirely different concerns and priorities? The mystery deepens when we consider the spacing and arrangement of multiple dwellings within a camp, the ways that individual shelters related to each other spatially, and the patterns that emerge when we map their positions. At some sites, shelters cluster tightly together, almost touching, walls nearly adjacent, entrances opening onto shared courtyards where people would have constantly interacted. At others, they spread out with considerable distance between them, each dwelling separated by tens of meters, creating privacy and autonomy at the cost of increased exposure when moving between structures. Sometimes they form rough circles around a central communal area, a shared space that might have been used for communal activities, large-scale food processing, ceremonies that involve the whole group. Sometimes they line up along a riverbank or ridge, following the terrain, but also creating a linear arrangement where each dwelling had its place in sequence. Each pattern surely reflects social organization, family relationships determining who lived near whom, hierarchies shaping who got prime locations and who occupied peripheral spots, functional divisions of labor creating specialist areas where particular activities were concentrated. But reading these patterns is like trying to understand a language from only a few scattered words, fragments of grammar and syntax that hint at structure but never provide enough information to reconstruct the whole system. We can guess that closely spaced shelters indicate closely related families, extended kin groups who cooperated intensively and shared resources. We can speculate that isolated shelters represent social distance, perhaps subordinate families, or newly formed units not yet fully integrated into the main group. But certainty eludes us. The spatial patterns are suggestive, but not definitive, open to multiple interpretations. Consider the evidence of seasonal occupation, the stories told by stratified deposits that reveal repeated use across time. At many sites, the archaeological layers show cycles. The camp was occupied, then abandoned, then reoccupied, then abandoned again, perhaps many times over centuries or even millennia. Between occupations, the structures deteriorated, the hides rotting away, the bones weathering and scattering, the hearths filling with wind-blown sediment. Then new inhabitants arrived, rebuilt the shelters using old bones and adding new ones, dug out the hearths and renewed the fires, spread fresh ash on floors, re-established human presence in this particular spot. Sometimes new shelters were built directly atop the ruins of old ones, the same location chosen again and again as if the spot itself had significance. Sometimes the camps shifted slightly, moving upslope or downslope a few meters, toward or away from water, adjusting position while remaining in essentially the same place. Why the movements, even the small ones? Practical reasons surely are part of the answer. Changes in water levels, rivers rising or falling or shifting channels might make a previously good camp location less convenient. Accumulation of refuse, the inevitable garbage of human occupation, bones and ash, and worn-out tools and organic waste would eventually make the immediate area unpleasant, requiring a shift to cleaner ground. Depletion of nearby resources, fuel and construction materials and game animals might force moves to locations where resources were more readily available. But perhaps there were also cultural reasons, beliefs and practices that shaped decisions in ways that had nothing to do with practical necessity. Beliefs about how long a place should be inhabited before it needed to rest, concepts of spiritual exhaustion or contamination that required periodic renewal, rituals of renewal that specifically required new construction, ceremonial burning of old structures and building of new ones as part of seasonal or generational cycles, taboos against dwelling where the dead had lived, fear that spirits of the deceased might linger and cause harm to new occupants, requiring avoidance or elaborate purification. The refuse heaps, archaeologists call them middens with professional detachment, near these shelters contain their own mysteries, their own provocations to speculation. Bones of animals, yes, thousands upon thousands of them, carefully studied to determine diet and hunting patterns, what species were targeted, how they were butchered, which body parts were brought back to camp, and which were abandoned at kill sites. But also broken tools, the inevitable failures and wear-outs of daily life, stone blades that snapped, bone needles that broke, scrapers worn too thin to be useful anymore. Worn-out clothing fragments, the scraps left when hide garments could no longer be repaired, remnants of boots and parkas and leggings worn through by use. Ash and charcoal, the residue of countless fires, dumped from hearths when they needed cleaning, and sometimes, disturbingly, human remains, bones of people mixed with bones of animals, and the debris of daily life. Some sites show clear evidence that the dead were buried within or very near the living camp, not removed to distant cemeteries but kept close, sometimes beneath shelter floors, sometimes just outside, in areas that would have been constantly visible and accessible to the living. Were these places of ongoing connection with ancestors, the living and dead sharing space in ways that maintained relationships across the boundary of mortality? Did people talk to the graves, leave offerings, seek advice from deceased elders? Or were burials simply pragmatic responses to frozen ground that made distant burial grounds impractical, the dead interred where they could be buried rather than where ideology might have preferred? The variety of burial practices itself is puzzling, suggesting complexity in how people thought about death and the proper treatment of bodies. Some individuals were buried with elaborate grave goods, complete toolkits, fine ornaments, ochre sprinkled or spread across the body in quantities that must have represented significant labor to gather and process, carved objects that seemed too valuable to simply discard with the dead. Others were buried with nothing, or nothing that survived, bodies placed in graves without accompaniment, sent into whatever came next, empty-handed. Some were placed in fetal positions, knees drawn up to chest, arms folded, bodies tightly curled as if sleeping or perhaps returning to the position of birth, a gesture that might have symbolized rebirth or return to the womb of Earth. Others were extended, laid out straight, arms at sides, a position that might have represented rest or peaceful sleep, or simply been easier to arrange in a narrow grave. Some graves show signs of repeated ritual, fires burned above them multiple times, the charcoal layers in the fill indicating return visits, offerings placed repeatedly over time, suggesting ongoing relationships with the deceased, continued presence in the lives of the living. Others seem unmarked, forgotten, bodies buried and then ignored, their graves receiving no special attention. Did these differences reflect social status, the high-ranking buried with honor and the low-ranking disposed of with minimal fuss? Age, with children and elders receiving different treatment than adults in their prime? Cause of death, with those who died violently or from disease treated differently than those who died peacefully? Personal preference, individuals requesting before death how they wanted to be treated, wishes honored by surviving family, clan affiliation, different family lines having different traditions. We construct theories, build arguments, marshal evidence, but the dead cannot confirm or deny our interpretations, cannot tell us whether we've understood their culture or projected our own assumptions onto their silent remains. Another enigma that haunts these sites, the evidence of long-distance trade or movement, the presence of materials that could not possibly have come from local sources. At mammoth steppe sites scattered across thousands of kilometers, archaeologists find materials that came from far away. Particular types of flint, available only in specific source areas hundreds of kilometers distant, recognizable by color and texture and crystal structure, shells from seas that required weeks of travel to reach, amber from Baltic coasts where it washes up on beaches, obsidian from volcanic regions where it forms in molten flows. These materials appear as tools, as ornaments, as raw materials stored for future use, proof that these remote camps were not isolated but connected to broader networks. How did these materials arrive? Through trade networks, goods passing from band to band across vast distances, each group taking a bit and passing the rest along. Chains of exchange that linked coast to interior, south to north, regions that never directly contacted each other but were connected through intermediaries. Through seasonal migrations, groups traveling annually or periodically to gather specific resources, journeys that took them hundreds of kilometers from winter camps to summer gathering places and back. Through raiding or theft, violent acquisition of goods from neighbors. Through gift exchanges that bound distant groups in alliances, marriages that created kin relationships spanning vast territories, obligations of hospitality that ensured travelers would be welcomed rather than killed. The presence of these exotic materials in shelters, made into tools that were used daily, ornaments worn on special occasions, ritual objects that may have derived power from their foreign origin, speaks to connections far beyond the immediate band, to a world more complex and interconnected than we might imagine. These were not isolated tribes, struggling alone against the ice, each group confined to its tiny territory, ignorant of others beyond the next valley. They were part of a larger human world, maintaining relationships of various kinds, sharing knowledge about resources and routes and dangers, exchanging goods and stories and perhaps genes across the mammoth steppe. The exotic materials are proof of these connections, tangible evidence of networks that left few other traces, but were nonetheless vital to survival and to the maintenance of cultural identity. Some of the most haunting mysteries concern what we call portable art, decorated objects small enough to carry, items that combine utility with aesthetics or symbolism or both. Bone fragments engraved with intricate patterns, parallel lines incised with stone tools, chevrons that zigzag across surfaces, dots punched in rows or spirals, abstract designs that may have been purely decorative or may have encoded information we cannot read. Stone plaques carved with animal figures, recognizable horses and mammoths, and bison rendered with skill that suggests both practiced hands and keen observation. Beads strung in specific patterns, colors, and materials alternating in ways that may have carried meaning. Red alternating with white, stone with shell, large with small. Sequences that might have been aesthetic choices or might have been messages, information encoded in physical form. Were these objects decorative expressions of aesthetic impulse, the human desire to make things beautiful for beauty's sake? Were they utilitarian, despite their decoration, objects that served practical purposes but were embellished because why not make tools attractive? Were they markers of ownership or group identity, ways of saying this belongs to me or to us, this pattern indicates my family or my band? Were they mnemonic devices encoding information in visual form, calendars tracking lunar phases or seasonal migrations, maps showing rivers and mountains and resource locations, stories preserved in symbols that initiated members could read? Were they religious or magical, protective symbols or prayers made tangible, objects believed to have power beyond their physical properties? At some sites, these decorated objects cluster near hearths or sleeping areas, suggesting they were kept where people gathered, where they could be seen and handled regularly. At others, they're found near entrances or in storage areas, positioned where they might serve as guardians or markers. At still others, they seem randomly scattered, as if dropped and forgotten or discarded when they were no longer needed or wanted. Each distribution pattern suggests different uses, different meanings, different roles in daily life. But we cannot interview the makers and users, cannot ask what they intended or believed or hoped. We can only examine what remains and speculate. The mystery of children's lives haunts these sites too, a particular poignancy in trying to understand the youngest inhabitants of these camps. Small bones are found, yes, evidence that children were present, that they lived and sometimes died in these cold places. But the material culture specifically associated with children is harder to identify, harder to recognize with certainty. Were there toys, objects made for play? The small carved animals and figurines might have been playthings, miniature mammoths and horses clutched in small hands, used in games and stories. Or they might have been strictly ritual objects forbidden to young hands, sacred items that only adults could touch. We cannot know without explicit context that rarely survives. Were there coming-of-age ceremonies, moments when children transitioned to adult status through ritual? Initiations that marked passage from one life stage to another, occasions when young people received their first real tools, their first important responsibilities, their first recognition as full members of the community. The archaeological record shows skilled toolmaking beginning in adolescence, young people producing increasingly sophisticated artifacts as they practiced and learned. But the social and ritual dimensions of this transition remain invisible. Were there ceremonies when a child made their first successful spear point, killed their first animal, completed their first hide garment? Celebrations, blessings, acknowledgements that would have been profoundly important to participants, but which leave no physical trace for archaeologists to discover. How were children taught? Through formal instruction, organized teaching sessions where elders demonstrated techniques and corrected mistakes. Or simply through observation and imitation, children watching adults constantly, absorbing knowledge through immersion in the work of daily life. Did elders deliberately pass down specific knowledge, stories encoding survival skills, techniques for tracking and hunting, understanding of plants and animals and weather, in structured ways, perhaps during long winter evenings when there was time for talk? Or did learning happen organically, woven into the fabric of daily life, children participating in adult activities as soon as they were able, gradually taking on more complex tasks as their skills increased? We see evidence of children's presence, small footprints preserved in ancient mud, now turned to stone, impressions that show where children ran or walked or played, child-sized clothing fragments found in refuse, garments that were outgrown and discarded, miniature tools that may have been learning aids, practice pieces made to fit small hands. But the texture of childhood, the emotional and social reality of being young in such a harsh world, remains largely lost. What games did children play? What songs did they sing? What stories did they tell each other? What fears kept them awake? What joys made them laugh? These questions, so vital to understanding the fullness of human experience, cannot be answered from bones and stones alone. The question, in a world where survival demanded every person's contribution, where the failure of any individual could threaten the whole band's survival, can we even speak of privilege? Can we identify elite or higher status when everyone struggled against the same cold, the same hunger, the same darkness? The answer, surprisingly, is yes. Even in the harshest circumstances, human societies create distinctions, hierarchies, roles that carry greater prestige, greater comfort, greater power. The archaeological evidence from mammoth steppe sites reveals these gradations, subtle but real. Let us imagine then the life of someone with status in this frozen world. Perhaps an elder, a keeper of knowledge, someone who had survived many winters and earned respect through experience and wisdom. Perhaps a skilled hunter, someone whose prowess in tracking and killing large game made them valuable, celebrated, given special consideration. Perhaps a shaman or spiritual leader, someone believed to communicate with the spirit world, to see what others could not see, to guide the band through ritual and vision. This person, let us call them an elder for simplicity, did not live in luxury. There was no luxury to be had, but there were degrees of comfort, small privileges that made the difference between misery and relative ease. The elder's shelter might have been larger, more carefully constructed. Perhaps it occupied the best position in the camp, most protected from wind, closest to water, oriented to catch maximum sun. Perhaps it was built with the finest materials, the largest mammoth bones for framework, the thickest and most supple hides for covering, the most carefully selected stones for the hearth. Inside, the arrangement might have reflected status. The elder might have claimed the warmest spot, closest to the fire yet far enough back to avoid the worst smoke. Perhaps they had a slightly raised sleeping platform, insulated with extra layers of hide and moss, keeping them off the cold ground. Perhaps they had more furs to sleep under, accumulated over years, gifts from grateful band members whose lives they had saved or guided. The elder's clothing might have been more elaborate, not just functional but decorated, beads sewn into patterns on the tunic, fox fur trimming the hood, special designs painted or embroidered on the outer layer. These decorations served as markers of status, visible signs that this person was not just another band member, but someone set apart, someone recognized. They might have worn ornaments, a necklace of carved ivory beads perhaps, or a pendant of polished stone. These objects, which represented hours or days of skilled labor to create, were not just pretty trinkets. They were wealth, portable and visible, a sign that this person commanded respect and could claim resources others could not. In terms of food, the privileges might have been subtle but significant. When a large animal was killed and butchered, the division of meat followed protocols. The elder might have received choice portions, the fatty tissues that provided crucial calories, the organs rich in nutrients, the marrow bones that could be cracked and savored. Not necessarily more food, but better food, the parts that sustained health and strength. During times of shortage, when the band's stores ran low and everyone went hungry, the elder might have been protected, given slightly larger rations, their needs prioritized because their survival was seen as essential to the group. A young, healthy adult could endure days of minimal food and recover. An elder, once weakened, might not survive. The elder's role in decision-making was likely central. When the band debated whether to move camp, where to hunt, how to respond to danger, the elder's voice carried weight. experience mattered in a world where knowledge was not written but remembered, where survival depended on recalling what had worked in past winters, past crises, past challenges. This person might have been the keeper of stories, oral histories that preserved essential information. Stories about where the mammoth herds had been seen in winters past. Stories about how ancestors had survived the worst blizzards, the deepest cold. Stories about other bands encountered, alliances made, conflicts resolved. Stories about the spirits, the rituals, the proper ways to treat the dead, to honor the animals, to maintain balance with forces beyond human control. In the long winter nights, when darkness pressed close and the fire flickered low, the elder might have been the one to speak, to teach, to remind the band of who they were and where they came from. These stories were not entertainment, though they may have entertained. They were essential knowledge, survival information encoded in narrative form, passed down through generations. The elder might have had apprentices, younger people, learning to fill the role when the elder eventually passed. These apprentices might have enjoyed some reflected status, living in or near the elder's shelter, helping with daily tasks in exchange for teaching. This created a kind of household, a center of knowledge and authority within the larger band. In terms of ritual and spiritual life, the elder's role would have been paramount if they served as a shaman or spiritual guide. They might have been responsible for performing rituals at crucial times, before major hunts, at seasonal transitions, when someone died or was born, when the band faced crisis. These rituals might have involved specific objects kept in the elder's shelter, carved figurines used in ceremonies, special pigments for body painting, stones, or bones believed to hold power. The shelter itself might have been considered a sacred space, the place where communication with the spirit world occurred. Access to such a shelter might have been restricted. Not everyone could enter freely, perhaps only at specific times during specific rituals with proper protocols observed. This created a boundary, a distinction between the elder's space and common space, reinforcing status and role. Yet for all these privileges, the elder remained vulnerable. Age brought its own hardships. Joints stiffened in the cold more than younger people's did. Vision dimmed, hearing faded, the ability to contribute physically declined. An elder who could no longer work, who could no longer hunt or gather or help with shelter construction, became dependent on the band's willingness to support them. This dependence was a kind of contract. The elder had contributed greatly in their youth and middle age, had accumulated knowledge and wisdom, had earned the right to support in old age. But if resources became desperately scarce, if the band faced starvation, such contracts could be strained or broken. Difficult choices had to be made. Not all elders survived every winter. The elder's status also brought responsibilities and burdens. They were expected to solve problems, to provide guidance, to bear the weight of decision-making. If a hunt failed repeatedly, if the winter proved exceptionally harsh, if people died despite precautions, some might blame the elder. Their advice was wrong, their rituals ineffective, their leadership insufficient. Status, then, was not simply privilege, it was a role with expectations, a position that demanded performance, a kind of bargain between the individual and the community. Let us consider another type of status. The master builder, the person whose skill in constructing shelters made them invaluable. This person would have spent years learning the craft, how to select the best bones, how to interlock them for maximum strength, how to angle the roof to shed snow, how to position the hearth for optimal warmth and minimal smoke. Such expertise was not common. It required experience, judgment, an eye for structure and stability. A well-built shelter could stand for years, protecting multiple families through multiple winters. A poorly built one could collapse, killing those inside, wasting precious resources and labor. The master builder might have traveled between bands, their skills in demand. They might have been compensated with food, hides, or other goods. They might have had a say in where camps were located, which sites were suitable for substantial dwelling construction, which should be used only temporarily. This person's shelter might not have been the largest, but it would have been the best constructed, a showcase of their skills, a demonstration that attracted clients and reinforced reputation. Everything about it would have been optimized: insulation, ventilation, structural stability, efficient use of space. Similarly, the master tool maker, the person who could knap flint with extraordinary precision, creating the sharpest blades, the most reliable spear points, would have enjoyed status. Good tools meant successful hunts, meant food, meant survival. Everyone needed tools, and everyone knew that quality varied. The best toolmaker could demand respect and compensation. This person's shelter might have been the workshop, the place where others brought raw materials and left with finished tools. The floor might have been covered in flint chips, the walls hung with partially finished pieces, the hearth used not just for warmth, but for heat-treating stone to improve its flaking properties. Status could also come from artistic skill. The person who carved the most beautiful figurines, who created the most striking decorative patterns, who had an eye for form and aesthetics. This person contributed something beyond mere survival. They created meaning, beauty, identity. In a world of relentless hardship, beauty was not frivolous, it was essential. It reminded people they were human, not merely animals struggling to survive. It created cultural identity, marking this band as distinct from others, creating pride and cohesion. The artist, then, had a role that transcended decoration, contributing to the band's psychological and social survival. Such a person might have received patronage of a sort, provided with materials, given time to work free from other duties. Their products circulated as gifts that established and maintained social bonds within and between bands. What about gender and status? The evidence is frustratingly ambiguous. Some burials of women show elaborate grave goods, suggesting high status. The famous Venus figurines, if they indeed represent real women, might indicate special status for women in spiritual or social life, but we cannot know for certain how gender intersected with privilege, power, and prestige. It is likely that different roles carried different kinds of status. Male hunters might have prestige in matters of the hunt and defense. Female craft workers might have had authority over hide preparation, clothing construction, food processing. Elders of either gender might have commanded respect for wisdom and knowledge. Shamans might have transcended ordinary gender roles, occupying a special category. The communal nature of survival meant that rigid hierarchies were probably limited. Everyone was too dependent on everyone else. The highest status elder still needed the young hunters to bring food, still needed the builders to maintain shelter, still needed the toolmakers to provide equipment. Interdependence created a kind of check on the accumulation of power. Yet inequality existed. Archaeology shows it clearly. Some individuals were buried with far more grave goods than others. Some shelters were substantially better constructed than others. Some people wore more ornaments, had access to more exotic materials, left behind more impressive artifacts. The question of how this inequality was maintained is fascinating. In modern societies, wealth and power are often inherited, passed from parents to children. Was this true in the Ice Age? Did the children of high-status individuals automatically enjoy advantages, better nutrition, better training, better social connections? Some evidence suggests yes. Burials of children sometimes include elaborate grave goods, more than we might expect based on their own accomplishments. These might be inherited status markers or gifts from parents, or indicators that the child was expected to inherit a special role before death intervened. But in such small bands, inheritance could only go so far. Demonstrated ability mattered enormously. A child born to a high-status hunter who could not hunt would not retain status based on parentage alone. Skill, strength, wisdom. These had to be proven, earned, displayed. Status might have been fluid, shifting with age and circumstance. A young person might gain status through successful hunts or craft mastery, enjoy respect and privilege in middle age, then lose some status in old age if they could no longer contribute. Or they might transition to elder status, trading physical contribution for wisdom and guidance. Imagine, then, an evening in winter. The high-status elder sits in the warmest place in their well-constructed shelter, wrapped in the finest furs, eating choice meat. Around them, apprentices and family members occupy less favorable positions. Outside, in smaller or less well-made shelters, other band members manage as best they can with fewer resources. Is this unjust? By modern standards, perhaps, but in context it might have made sense to the people involved. The elder had earned privileges through years of contribution. The apprentices accepted lesser comfort in exchange for learning. The others recognized that supporting the elder meant supporting the knowledge and wisdom that benefited everyone. And when crisis came, when a blizzard threatened, when the shelter began to collapse, when food ran desperately short, the privileges might have meant less. Everyone faced the same danger. The cold did not respect status. The wind did not spare the well-decorated tunic. The hunger gnawed at prestigious and common alike. In such moments, the band pulled together. The elder's shelter might have opened to house those whose own dwellings failed. The master builder might have worked alongside novices to make emergency repairs. The privileged might have shared from their stores to keep the community alive, because ultimately no individual could survive alone, no matter how high their status. The band's survival was everyone's survival. Privilege existed within a framework of mutual dependence, tempered by the harsh reality that the cold respected nothing but fire, nothing but shelter, nothing but human cooperation against inhuman conditions. As we contemplate this world of subtle hierarchies and careful balances, we see that even in the depths of the Ice Age, humans created complex societies, not simple survival machines, but social worlds with roles and rules, privileges and responsibilities, status and reciprocity. The shelters that protected them were not just physical structures but social architecture, spaces that reflected and reinforced community organization, that mapped relationships and hierarchies onto bone and hide frameworks that created homes in every sense of that word. And now, as our journey through this frozen world draws toward its close, let us gather these threads together and reflect on all we have witnessed, on all we have imagined, on the distance we have traveled from that harsh past to our present moment. The fire has burned low, the night has deepened, and we find ourselves here at the end of our journey through the frozen past, having walked alongside people who lived 25,000 years ago, who struggled against cold we can barely imagine, who built shelters from the bones of giants and called them home. Let us pause here, in this quiet moment, and consider the distance we have traveled, not just backward through time, but forward from that world to this one. You, lying in warmth and comfort, perhaps in a bed with sheets and blankets, perhaps in a room where temperature is controlled by mechanisms that would seem like magic to those ancient people. You have walls that are solid, permanent, proof against any wind. You have heat that comes at the touch of a button or the turn of a dial. You have light that banishes darkness with a simple switch. The struggles we have imagined together, the desperate search for wood in deep snow, the endless repairs to failing shelters, the gnawing hunger when food stores dwindled, the bone-deep cold that never quite left. These are not your struggles. You are separated from that world not just by millennia, but by an immense gulf of technology, comfort, and security. Think of water. For them, every drink required labor, gathering snow, melting it, filtering it, all while risking frostbite and exhaustion. For you, water flows from a tap, warm or cold at your choice, pure and plentiful, requiring nothing but the effort of turning your hand. Think of food. For them, every meal was uncertain, dependent on successful hunts, on preserved stores that might not last, on their ability to find and extract calories from a landscape that grudged every bite. For you, food is abundant, available, requiring only the resources to obtain it, not the days of tracking and the life-threatening effort of bringing down large prey. Think of shelter. For them, every dwelling was temporary, fragile, requiring constant maintenance and repair, always on the edge of failure, always threatened by storms and cold. For you, shelter is solid, reliable, a place of safety taken so completely for granted that you might never think about it at all. This is the gift of all the generations between, the accumulated knowledge, the refined technology, the social organization that created the world you inhabit. Every innovation, every improvement, every lesson learned and passed forward has built the edifice of comfort that surrounds you now. But in acknowledging this distance, we should not forget our connection. The people we have walked beside tonight were not fundamentally different from you. They had the same basic human needs: warmth, safety, connection, meaning. They loved and grieved and hoped just as you do. They looked at their children with the same fierce protectiveness, felt the same relief when danger passed, experienced the same small joys in moments of beauty or rest. They were, in every way that matters, us. Just us in different circumstances, us facing challenges we no longer face, us making do with resources we no longer need. Their ingenuity built the foundation everything else stands on. Their survival ensured that you exist. Every person alive today descends from people who endured winters like those we have imagined, who found ways to keep fire burning when wood was scarce, who constructed shelters that barely sufficed but sufficed enough, who passed knowledge forward so that each generation could do a little better than the last. The mammoth bone dwellings, the hide-covered frameworks, the carefully tended hearths, these were the ancestors of your walls and roof and heating system, the techniques they developed, the lessons they learned, the solutions they innovated, rippled forward through time, evolving and improving, but never completely losing touch with their origins. And perhaps on some level, we still carry their world within us. Perhaps when you feel most comfortable by a fire on a cold night, you are touching something ancient, some deep memory of when fire was the only barrier between life and death. Perhaps when you feel the satisfaction of a secure home, you are echoing the relief your distant ancestors felt when they finally got their shelter properly sealed against the wind. As you lie here now, drifting towards sleep, let yourself feel the comfort that surrounds you. Feel the softness of your bedding, the warmth of your room, the security of your walls. Let yourself appreciate, for just a moment, the extraordinary privilege of not having to worry whether you will survive the night, whether the cold will overwhelm you, whether your shelter will hold. And perhaps as you drift, spare a thought for those who came before. For the unnamed multitudes who struggled and survived so that eventually, thousands of years later, you could exist in comfort. For the child buried at Malta with his ivory treasures. For the builders who raised dwellings from mammoth bones. For the hunters who walked through deep snow. For the elders who kept knowledge alive through the long dark. They are gone now, returned to earth and dust and memory. Their shelters have collapsed, their fires have long since gone cold, their bones lie scattered beneath soil and stone. But they lived, they mattered. They made choices and took actions that reverberated forward through time. And in some small way, by remembering them tonight, by imaginatively walking alongside them through their frozen world, we honor them. We acknowledge the debt we owe. we recognize that the comfort we enjoy was built on their endurance, their resilience, their refusal to give up when giving up would have been so much easier than continuing. Let that thought be a comfort too as you settle deeper into rest. You are part of an immense story, a chain of survival and adaptation stretching back through uncountable generations. You are the inheritor of all their struggles, the beneficiary of all their innovations, the living testament that their efforts were not in vain. The cold they faced is far from you now. The darkness they endured has been pushed back. The hunger they knew has been vanquished, at least for you, at least for tonight. Rest now in warmth and safety. Sleep deeply without the need to wake and tend the fire, without worries about collapsed shelters or winter storms or dwindling food stores. Sleep with gratitude for the vast distance between their world and yours, and with respect for the people who bridged that distance through centuries of effort and ingenuity. The story of the prehistoric shelters, of the people who built them and lived within them and survived against all odds. This story has been told. The journey through ice and bone and hardship. This journey has been made. And now, gently, quietly, as the last embers of the ancient fires fade in your imagination, as the last echoes of footsteps in snow grow silent, as the shelters dissolve back into the earth from which they rose. Now you can rest. Good night, traveler. May your sleep be warm and peaceful, undisturbed by the cold that haunted our ancestors, protected by the walls they first imagined building so very long ago beneath the frozen stars.